Hey guys, tonight we're climbing into a lumpy, lice-ridden straw mattress, squashed between a crumbling wattle wall and a snoring cousin, to uncover one of the weirdest, most widely misunderstood aspects of the Middle Ages: what sex was actually like. The truth? It's awkward, noisy, fragrant in the worst way, and shockingly well documented. You're going to hear the creak of rope beds, smell the unwashed centuries, and meet couples who had to share not just a home, but a bed, with half their extended family watching. You probably won't survive this journey without cringing at least 3 times. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there. I always read those. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You lie down on a medieval bed, and the first thing you notice is the sheer volume of everything. The mattress is a sack stuffed with straw or feathers, if you're lucky, and the ropes underneath creak like a dying goose every time you move. That's actually where we get the phrase "sleep tight." It referred to tightening the ropes beneath the bed so your mattress didn't sag into a hammock of regret. Now imagine trying to be intimate on that. Privacy? Forget about it. Most medieval homes were one-room affairs. The whole family, parents, siblings, grandparents, often shared the same space, and sometimes the same bed. If you lived in a peasant hut, your livestock might even be sleeping nearby, snuffling in the corner while you fumble with your laces. Romance. For the rich, things were only slightly better. Yes, you had your own room. Maybe a tester bed with heavy velvet curtains. But servants were always nearby, often sleeping on pallets at your feet. And if you were royalty? Someone might be assigned to watch you consummate your marriage. Not in a weird voyeur way, well, not entirely, but as a legal witness that you'd done the deed. Sex, in the Middle Ages, was rarely just about pleasure. It was duty. It was documentation. And often, it was a performance. That said, the mechanics of desire didn't change. People still got aroused, fell in love, or at least lust, and acted on it, in ways that feel very familiar and, at the same time, hilariously alien. Let's talk sleeping arrangements. You're not cuddling under a fluffy duvet. More like a scratchy wool blanket that smells faintly of mildew and mutton. Your bed is raised off the floor, partly to avoid rats, and partly to assert a sliver of status. Bed frames were valuable. So much so that they were often mentioned in wills. To my dearest daughter, I leave the good bed with 4 posts and least amount of urine stains. It wasn't uncommon for an entire household to climb into one big bed for warmth. There are documented cases of 8 or more people cramming into a single mattress: men, women, children, unrelated travelers. You're spooning a stranger while trying not to make eye contact with your aunt. It's a literal medieval sleepover, minus the popcorn. And let's just acknowledge the smells. There's no deodorant. No daily shower. Bathing might happen once a month, if that. You wash your face and hands, sure. But full body cleansing? That was often reserved for special occasions. Like weddings. Or plague recovery. Yet, strangely, people still got turned on. Maybe it was the musk. Or maybe it was because everyone smelled equally horrific, so you didn't notice. Here's the fun bit: historians still argue whether medieval people found natural body odor arousing, or just endured it. Some suggest that earthy, sweaty smells were associated with vitality and strength. Others say they just didn't have options. After all, when you live in a world where scented rosewater is a luxury item, sweat is the default perfume. Speaking of perfume, wealthier folks might apply herbs and oils to cover up their stench. Lavender, rosemary, or crushed mint leaves were rubbed on clothes or skin. If you couldn't afford that, you just hoped your partner was congested. Then there's the issue of time. People went to bed early, not because they were wholesome, but because there was nothing else to do. No Netflix. No LED lights. Once the sun set, you lit a candle or maybe an oil lamp, and those were expensive. So bedtime came at sundown. Interestingly, there's evidence that people didn't sleep all the way through the night. They had what was called first sleep and second sleep. After a few hours of rest, they would often wake up for an hour or two in the middle of the night, pray, smoke, or, yes, have sex, before drifting off again. This natural intermission might have actually encouraged nighttime intimacy. But what about the actual act? Well, this was a society obsessed with reproduction, not recreation. Sex was for babies, preferably male, preferably legitimate. Pleasure was tolerated, but only as a byproduct of procreation. If you were caught having sex purely for enjoyment, especially outside of marriage, you could face punishment, public shaming, or worse. Unless you were noble. In which case, you probably just got a stern letter from the bishop and an invitation to confess. Still, people made it work. They had code words, quiet rituals, and stolen moments of privacy. Maybe you sneak out to the barn after dark. Maybe you bribe the servants for an extra hour alone. Maybe you pretend to pray really, really hard under the covers. Necessity, after all, is the mother of invention. And believe it or not, some people genuinely enjoyed themselves. We have medieval love poems, some awkward, some surprisingly tender, that hint at a world of passion, despite the constraints. A man might describe his lover's rosy garden or the tower of his desire. Subtle? Not always. But definitely sincere. There's even art, carvings on misericords, those fold-down seats in churches, showing lovers tangled in limbs, monks caught in compromising positions, and animals acting out human indiscretions for laughs. It's like the bathroom graffiti of the 14th century. And it tells us something very human, no matter the era, people have always made jokes about sex. As for contraception, well, that's a whole other headache. Most methods were unreliable, some dangerous. We'll get to that soon. For now, you lie back in your medieval bed, the straw crinkling under you, a candle flickering on the wall, and you wonder, how did people even get in the mood? Maybe it was the danger. The stolen nature of it all. The shared warmth in a cold world. Or maybe, just maybe, it was love. You wake before dawn, stiff from the straw poking through your mattress and your cousin's elbow jammed into your ribs. Someone in the corner is snoring like a saw through wet wood, and the room smells faintly of damp wool, sour breath, and something that might be turnips. And still, someone, somewhere, is trying to flirt. Because in the medieval world, hygiene isn't a private matter. It's a public negotiation. You smell you, but you also smell them, and attraction becomes a game of risk, resistance, and rosemary. The average medieval person didn't bathe daily. Or weekly. Sometimes not even monthly. Depending on where you lived, climate, class, and religion, full-body bathing could be seen as anything from a luxury to a sin. Yes, a sin. Some church authorities believed too much bathing stirred sinful thoughts. You know, because being clean apparently led straight to debauchery. So you better keep that armpit grimy or risk eternal damnation. But here's the twist, people did care about cleanliness. Just not in the way you might expect. You rise from your creaky rope bed and head to the communal wash basin. There's no soap like we know it. You scrub with ash, sand, or, if you're lucky, homemade lye soap that's roughly equivalent to rubbing your body with a scouring pad soaked in bacon grease. Still, you make the effort, splashing water on your face, behind your ears, maybe even between your toes. Because even if you stink, you don't want to reek. And yes, despite popular myths, some people bathed more than you'd think. Roman-style bathhouses lingered in parts of Europe well into the Middle Ages. Public baths were common in cities like Paris, London, and Cologne. You strip down, slip into warm water, and immediately regret your life choices as someone's scab drifts past. The bath is less a spa, more a medieval hot tub meet and greet. Which sounds fun, until you remember most people didn't wear underwear and there are 0 chlorine tablets. Historians still argue whether bathhouses were genuinely centers of cleanliness or just barely veiled brothels. Some were divided by gender, others not. Some had strict codes of conduct. Others had, let's say, service menus. You can imagine the confusion. You think you're paying for a towel, but get offered a happy ending instead. And then, of course, there were the smells. Even freshly bathed, a person wasn't exactly fragrant. Medieval cleanliness was about reducing the offensive stench more than achieving a state of scentless bliss. So what did people use to smell good? Herbs were the answer to nearly everything. You hang little bundles of lavender or thyme around your neck. Rub mint leaves under your arms. Some even tucked dried rosemary or sage into their underclothes, hoping to mask the whiff of hard labor and old cheese. If you were rich, you could buy exotic spices, cinnamon, cloves, or imported frankincense, to burn or blend into scented oils. Imagine a medieval Tinder date. You meet in a candlelit hall, your tunic reeks of clove and goat, and you compliment your lover's thyme-sprig hairnet. Hot. Let's not forget the mouth situation. Medieval dental care was enthusiastic but ineffective. People used sticks to scrape their teeth, rinsed with vinegar or wine, and chewed herbs to freshen their breath. Did it work? Sometimes. But remember, no sugar meant fewer cavities than you might expect. Most people had surprisingly decent teeth, at least until scurvy or syphilis kicked in. Still, kissing could be an act of courage. Now, imagine you're trying to seduce someone. There's no Axe body spray. No scented candles. No bath bomb foreplay. But you do have onions. No, really. One folk remedy said rubbing onions under your armpits boosted libido. Another involved garlic oil as a love charm. You'd be lucky to survive a date without your nostrils retreating into your skull. And yet, people still manage to fall in love. Or lust. Or both. In royal courts, perfumed gloves were a luxury gift. A noblewoman might press a rose-scented glove to her admirer's lips as a sign of favor. Men sometimes wore small pomanders, little metal balls filled with herbs or ambergris, on chains around their necks or belts. If you caught a whiff of musk and civet, it might mean someone was very wealthy or a medieval furry. Meanwhile, peasants made do with soapwort and superstition. Clothing added another layer to the sensory experience. Wool, linen, and leather, all natural, all absorbent. Your shirt hasn't been washed in weeks, but at least it's aired out. Sort of. And if you're wearing fur? Congratulations, you now smell like wet dog on a summer afternoon. And yet, here you are, about to lean in for a kiss, your breath fermented, your body seasoned, your doublet slightly moist. Does it stop anyone? Not really. Why? Because attraction wasn't just physical. It was economic. Social. Spiritual. A good match was someone whose family had land. Whose body could survive childbirth. Whose nose had already adapted to the daily funk. Quirky fact, in some regions, young couples were encouraged to sleep in the same bed, fully clothed, before marriage. It was called bundling, and yes, it's exactly what it sounds like. You're sewn or wrapped into a bag or blanket to prevent hanky-panky, but honestly, who thought that would work? Historians still argue whether bundling was genuinely chaste or just rural parents giving up. Either way, it often led to what the church called premarital entanglements and what we'd call oops. Let's not pretend everyone accepted the stink without complaint. Medieval literature is full of people mocking each other's odor. You might call someone goat-breathed or mutton-mouthed. There were even popular stories of men being tricked into marrying beautiful women who, surprise, smelled like rotting fish. Which brings us to the medieval deodorant of choice, judgment. Social pressure did what soap couldn't. If you smelled too bad, people would talk. And in tight-knit communities, that could ruin your chances at courtship, marriage, or business. So while medieval people might not meet modern standards of cleanliness, they weren't oblivious. They understood hygiene as a balance between effort, resources, and ritual. You did what you could. You washed on holy days. You scrubbed with herbs. You chewed cloves before flirting. And you hoped the other person did the same. And perhaps, just perhaps, you fell in love with the scent of someone familiar. The wool of their cloak. The smoke in their hair. The trace of time where a collar met skin. Because in a world without soap, attraction wasn't about masking who you were, it was about recognizing it, and choosing to lean in anyway. You pull the scratchy wool blanket up to your chin, the fire in the hearth long extinguished, and the chill settling into your bones. But someone nearby is whispering, giggles, then silence, then the unmistakable sound of straw rustling. And suddenly, your mind drifts to one of the great medieval obsessions, virginity. It's not just a personal matter. It's political, religious, legal. Entire wars could start over whether a woman bled on a sheet her wedding night. You blink in the darkness and realize you live in a time when a tiny membrane, or the belief in one, can determine your fate. In medieval Europe, virginity wasn't just a concept. It was currency. It was evidence of virtue, proof of paternity, and a family's best shot at a decent alliance. For women, anyway. Men? Well, let's just say the double standard was alive and galloping on horseback. A girl's virginity was so prized that there were actual rituals to verify it. On wedding nights, the couple's bed linens might be examined for blood as proof of defloration. And if there wasn't any? Oh dear. The new husband might claim he'd been tricked. The bride's family might be shamed, or worse, sued. Of course, we now know that the hymen isn't a tamper-evident seal. It can tear during childhood, from riding horses, dancing, or simply existing with a body. But medieval medicine didn't get that memo. Doctors, mostly men, with limited hands-on experience, wrote endlessly about signs of virginity. A tight womb. A narrow gait. An aversion to lewd jokes. If she blushed? Clearly a virgin. If she didn't blush? Definitely not. Historians still argue whether these signs were believed in earnest or just used to control women's bodies. But either way, a girl's future often depended on meeting an impossible standard. Now imagine you're a young woman, maybe 14, betrothed to a man twice your age. You're taught to protect your virtue like a knight guards a castle. Every look, every laugh, every unchaperoned walk could spark rumors. You sleep in shared quarters, change clothes behind drapes, and pray no one mistakes friendliness for flirtation. But what if you weren't a virgin? Here comes the medieval hackathon. You might bribe a midwife to sew you shut temporarily, yes, really. Or use a sponge soaked in chicken blood. Or carry a charm said to restore your maidenhead. In some communities, there were folk healers who specialized in renewing virginity with herbs, magic, or whispered incantations. You'd be amazed how creative desperation can be. And what about the other side of the coin? You're a man, maybe a noble, and your bride is stunning, but quiet. The pressure to perform is immense. Not just personally, but publicly. If you can't consummate the marriage, your peers might laugh, your allies might question your masculinity, and your wife's family might call off the deal. In some cases, couples were asked to prove their union in front of witnesses. Yes, actual witnesses. You lie in bed while the priest blesses the sheets and nobles linger in the next room, listening for signs of success. Some even watched from behind curtains. It's less wedding night, more live podcast with an uncomfortable audience. Quirky fact? There were actual instruction manuals for this moment. One 15th century text explained to the groom that he should gently place his yard in the woman's nature, without hastiness. Poetic, who? Of course, not every marriage began this way. Poorer couples often eloped, jumped over a broom, or whispered vows under moonlight. But even they weren't free from virginity's grip. If a woman had a reputation, even just whispers, her worth on the marriage market could plummet. Which brings us to the concept of deflowering. It wasn't just biological. It was symbolic. Poets waxed lyrical about plucking roses, unlocking garden gates, or sailing to undiscovered shores. You, dear listener, might be the first explorer. And your bride? A sacred land, untouched by any but the divine. Unless she wasn't. If a woman was found to be non-virginal, her options were bleak. She might be sent to a convent, disowned, or forced to marry below her station. In some cases, she was accused of fornication and punished by law. That could mean a fine, or a flogging, or standing barefoot in the town square holding a sign that read something like, "I lost my virtue and my common sense." Now, here's the kicker. Not everyone believed in the absolute purity model. Some medieval thinkers, often heretical or fringe, argued that love mattered more than anatomy. In southern France, the troubadour poets praised women for their wit and passion, not just chastity. And in certain cultures, like parts of early medieval Ireland, virginity wasn't required for marriage, it was more of a polite suggestion. Even within the church, there were contradictions. Virginity was praised as holy, but married sex was sacred too, as long as it made babies. Some theologians insisted that Mary remained a virgin even after childbirth. Others debated whether a woman could regain her virginity through confession. Spoiler, she couldn't, but it made everyone feel better. Meanwhile, saints were held up as models of perfect chastity. Young girls would fast, flagellate themselves, or wear spiked chains under their dresses to protect their bodies from temptation. One saint reportedly threw herself into a thorn bush to avoid rape, then thanked God for the bleeding. And yet, in the margins of this purity parade, life went on. People had sex. People made mistakes. People lied, loved, regretted, and tried again. And not every story ended in shame. There are records of noble women defending their premarital affairs in court, arguing that love justified their choices. One German lady in the 1400s even claimed she was married in her heart before the physical act, and therefore innocent in God's eyes. Bold move. And while female virginity was policed, male virginity was often laughed off. A young man was expected to sow his oats before settling down. Unless he was becoming a priest. Then chastity was mandatory, at least on paper. In reality, many clerics had housekeepers who somehow kept getting pregnant. Go figure. So as you lie there, wondering what medieval sex education looked like, spoiler, confusing, remember this, virginity wasn't just a state of being. It was a tool. A myth. A cage. A crown. And sometimes, a lie told to survive another day. The church bell rings at dawn, echoing across mossy rooftops and empty cobbled streets, and before you've even finished blinking sleep from your eyes, someone has already committed a sin. Or at least, they think they have. Welcome to the medieval soul's constant wrestling match between heaven and hormones. You stretch, blink up at the low wooden rafters, and feel the invisible weight pressing down on everyone in the Middle Ages, the church's eye. Watching. Judging. Forgiving. Sometimes. Sex, in the medieval worldview, wasn't private. It wasn't even yours. It belonged, first and foremost, to God. Then your confessor. Then maybe your spouse. Maybe. If you were lucky. Every desire had to pass through a moral filter. But the filter was inconsistent, full of holes and double standards. So even as the church preached celibacy, its own leaders, well, didn't always practice what they preached. Clerics penned treatises on the evils of fornication. They categorized sins into elaborate hierarchies. Lustful thoughts were bad, masturbation was worse, sex outside marriage? Damnable. But sex in marriage? That was fine, technically. As long as it wasn't for fun. You could have sex to procreate, but if you enjoyed it a little too much, best confess before breakfast. So you trudged to church. It's Sunday. And on the stone steps outside, someone's muttering the latest scandal. That knight's daughter was caught sneaking into the stable. That widow's belly grew suspiciously fast. And yet, everyone's pretending to be shocked when most of them are doing the exact same thing. Welcome to Moral Whiplash, Medieval Edition. The church, for all its fire and brimstone, was also strangely pragmatic. Priests knew people would have sex. So they tried to control it rather than eliminate it. They issued penitentials, manuals for confessors that listed sins and their corresponding punishments. Lustful glance? 2 days of penance. Fornication with a relative? Fast for 40 days. Sex during Lent? You monster, go barefoot for a month and donate extra grain. You could practically gamify your sins. And then came the loopholes. Sex wasn't permitted on feast days, or fast days, or Sundays, or Wednesdays, or Fridays, or the 40 days before Easter, or the 40 days before Christmas. Add it up, and you're left with about 90 sin-free nights a year, if you had the energy after harvesting cabbages and avoiding plague. But of course, people didn't wait for papal permission. A peasant couple might steal kisses behind the chicken coop. A merchant might visit a brothel on market day and confess before sunset. A noblewoman might take a handsome squire into her bed while her husband was off crusading, and then buy an indulgence to keep her soul tidy. Historians still argue whether the church's grip on daily life was total or theatrical. In some regions, sermons were taken as gospel. In others, they were endured like bad weather. You listened. You nodded. You went home and did what you were going to do anyway. But in the monasteries, the rules were different. Stricter. Or, depending on who you ask, stranger. Monks and nuns were supposed to embody spiritual purity. No sex. No flirting. No thoughts of fleshly pleasure. But try telling that to a 23-year-old monk who just saw a milkmaid bathing in the river. There are letters, real, preserved in monasteries, of monks confessing their struggles. Some fell in love. Some broke their vows. Some convinced themselves that a little sin was okay if it led to deeper repentance. Classic loophole logic. There's a 12th century tale of a nun who disguised herself as a man to enter a monastery and live near her forbidden lover. She maintained the ruse for years before being caught. And some abbesses were known to keep secret lovers or even run their convents like small kingdoms, with more silk sheets than sermons. Then there's the infamous Pope Alexander VI. He had multiple mistresses, threw lavish orgies, and sired children while preaching chastity. Even within the clergy, sex was simultaneously condemned and, well, condoned, if you had the right connections. Let's not forget the visuals. Medieval churches had carvings, on the very pews people sat on, of naked figures, suggestive poses, and beasts engaging in rather graphic antics. They weren't just warnings. Sometimes they were jokes. Mischievous reminders that even in a holy place, desire persisted. Quirky fact? There was a belief that demons could impregnate women through dreams. These were called incubi, and male spirits that attacked sleeping women. So if you woke up pregnant and unmarried, you weren't sinful. You were haunted. Not a great explanation, but better than stoning. Even married couples had limits. You couldn't have sex during pregnancy, or menstruation, or when sick, or during times of mourning. You begin to realize, being in a medieval marriage was like having a very fussy roommate who also tracked your sins. And yet, despite all these rules, people carved out space for intimacy. Couples whispered under blankets. Lovers met in meadows. Wives and husbands found moments of joy, even if they confessed them away the next morning. It wasn't all guilt and gloom. Some theologians, like Thomas Aquinas, believed sex in marriage was not only acceptable but a duty. It maintained social order, ensured reproduction, and, yes, could strengthen affection, as long as pleasure wasn't the goal. Because medieval Christianity didn't hate sex. It feared what sex represented: chaos, emotion, power, rebellion. The same energy that could create life could also topple hierarchies. So it had to be contained. But no system is perfect. And between the cracks of canon law, human nature always found a way to bloom, wild, fragrant, and often slightly scandalous. So as the bells toll again and the village trudges into the chapel to confess sins they plan to repeat, you smile quietly. Because the truth is, beneath the incense and Latin prayers, everyone's still human. Still craving warmth. Still stealing glances when the priest's back is turned. And somewhere in a dim corner of the cathedral, a carved gargoyle smirks knowingly. You're walking through the monastery garden, pretending to admire the cabbages, when you catch sight of her, robes rustling, eyes cast down, cheeks pink from the sun, or something entirely more dangerous. And just like that, the cloister doesn't feel so sacred anymore. Tonight, you're slipping behind the walls of medieval celibacy, into the hushed halls and narrow stone corridors where monks and nuns lived, prayed, and, sometimes, fell deeply, inconveniently, sinfully in love. Because here's the truth, the medieval church demanded celibacy, but human hearts didn't always obey. The monasteries were supposed to be fortresses of purity, echoing with chant, not moans. But they were also full of people, lonely, curious, imperfect people. It starts, perhaps, with a glance across the refectory. A brush of fingers when passing a book. A shared smile at a private joke. And soon, your thoughts are less about psalms and more about possibilities. The church took monastic vows seriously. Monks and nuns weren't just expected to abstain from sex, they were to detach entirely from earthly desire. Their bodies were meant to be tools of prayer, not passion. But behind convent walls and abbey gates, temptation sprouted like weeds between the flagstones. There are records, so many records, of monastic scandal. In one 14th century English convent, nearly a third of the nuns were rumored to have lovers. A visiting bishop tried to correct the situation. The nuns threatened to curse him with boils. He backed off. One monk wrote, in a shaky confession, that he had been led astray by the devil disguised as Brother Thomas's thighs. Another nun, caught sneaking into the garden at night, claimed she was conversing with angels. Sure, Sister Agnes. Angels who smelled like mead and leather. Historians still argue whether these affairs were rare exceptions or common secrets. Some suggest monastic life bred longing by its very repression. Others point to deep companionships that may have been emotional, not physical, what we might now call romantic friendships. But every once in a while, the veil slipped. Take the case of Hildegard of Bingen. A brilliant abbess and mystic, she wrote soaring poetry about divine love, and some historians speculate she may have had an intense, possibly romantic, relationship with a younger nun. Was it physical? Was it spiritual? Or were the two even separable in her mind? Quirky fact, some monasteries were built with double cloisters, one for men, one for women, separated by a wall but connected by shared chapels. So if you were creative, and most sinners are, there were ways to pass notes, lock eyes, or sneak a midnight rendezvous under the cover of divine inspiration. The church, of course, tried to maintain control. Punishments for breaking vows ranged from extra penance to expulsion, or in some cases, physical mutilation. Yes, really. In particularly brutal cases, monks caught in acts of fornication might be castrated. Nuns were sometimes publicly shamed or reassigned to stricter convents. But enforcement was inconsistent. Powerful abbeys protected their own. Wealthy nuns, usually from noble families, could buy silence. And some monastic leaders simply looked the other way, choosing prayer over scandal. There's one account from 13th century France of an abbot who discovered two monks in an embrace unbecoming their vows. Instead of punishment, he ordered them to copy out psalms by hand for a year. That's one way to make sure they kept their hands busy. Still, not every monastic entanglement was secret or shameful. Some relationships were deeply loving, sustained for years, and even documented in private letters. A pair of nuns in Germany exchanged dozens of notes expressing devotion, longing, and, on occasion, very unholy admiration for each other's gentle warmth and voice that makes the soul tremble. And then there were the quiet affairs between clerics and outsiders. A traveling friar might fall for a baker's daughter. A novice nun might be seduced by a visiting scholar. These stories were whispered in market squares, sung in cheeky ballads, or immortalized in woodcuts too scandalous for Sunday school. One particularly juicy illustration from a 15th century manuscript shows a monk lifting his robe to reveal, not divine light, but a disturbingly cheerful face painted where it should not be. It's hard to tell if it was satire, art, or just someone really, really bored in the scriptorium. So, how did these secret liaisons begin? Often, it was about proximity and loneliness. Monks and nuns were isolated from society but not from each other. Days were filled with silent work, structured prayers, and long, contemplative hours. In those spaces, a shared word could become a lifeline. A hand on the shoulder could spiral into something far more dangerous. And the guilt? Oh, it burned. One nun wrote in her diary that she wept every night after allowing Brother Adrian to kiss my hand too long, for I felt a fire in me that was not of God. She then fasted for 3 days and washed her mouth with vinegar. Romance was not easy under divine surveillance. Sometimes, though, guilt gave way to justifications. We are made in His image, a monk wrote, and His image is love. So when I love, it is holy. Bold move, brother. Hope the abbot didn't read that one. There were even stories, some likely true, some wildly embroidered, of entire convents turning into semi-secret brothels. One infamous example comes from 15th century Italy, where a bishop raided a convent and discovered it functioning as a high-end pleasure house. No one ever proved the charges, but the story was too delicious not to spread. And yet, amidst all the naughtiness, there's something tender here. You sense it in the letters. In the margins of prayer books. In the songs sung quietly after Vespers. These were people who gave up families, wealth, and freedom for a life of service, and sometimes, they just needed to be held. Their love wasn't always carnal. Sometimes it was just human. The comfort of connection in a world of stone walls and silent halls. So as you picture the Abbey now, don't just see cold asceticism. See longing. See risk. See stolen moments beneath stained glass, under stars, behind heavy oaken doors. Because even in the most sacred spaces, desire found its way in, softly, like a breath in prayer. You're barely awake when you hear the muffled sound of clapping and laughter outside. Not children. Not monks. Grown men and women, tipsy, eager, and definitely not there to pray. You sit up and realize what's happening, someone's getting married. And tonight, there's going to be a bedding ceremony. Yes, a ceremony. Because in medieval Europe, even your first night of sex might be a public event. Not public like a parade, but public enough that you might wish the ground would swallow you whole before anyone starts untying anything. Here's the scene, it's your wedding night. You're exhausted, full of stewed meat and cheap wine, and dressed in 3 layers of wool. But the night's not over. Not until you and your new spouse are escorted, yes, escorted, to the marriage bed by a cheering crowd of family, friends, clergy, and possibly a bard strumming inappropriate tunes. This, dear listener, is not privacy. It's performance. Bedding ceremonies were serious business. The church needed proof that a marriage had been consummated, because only then was it legally binding. No consummation? No deal. Even if the vows had been said, and even if your cousin spent 3 months embroidering your wedding tunic. So, the goal was to get you into bed and, well, to get on with it. In noble households, this often meant actual witnesses. Not to the act itself, usually, but to everything leading up to it. You'd be ceremonially undressed by attendants, sometimes of the same gender, sometimes not, and then tucked into bed together while prayers were murmured. There might be songs, dirty jokes, and gifts tossed into the bed for fertility. And then everyone would slowly, cheerfully, leave. Except sometimes they didn't. Some traditions held that witnesses stayed just long enough to see some physical contact, maybe a kiss, maybe a leg over the other, before finally departing. Occasionally, more intrusive proofs were required. In a few well-documented cases, noble couples were expected to display the blood-stained sheets the next morning as evidence of defloration. Quirky fact? In parts of Scandinavia, guests would bang pots and shout outside the honeymoon chamber to encourage the couple, and, perhaps, mask the sounds. Medieval mood music, if you will. But before you judge, remember, marriage wasn't just about love. It was about land, inheritance, and legitimacy. Without consummation, children could be considered illegitimate, alliances void, and dowries in dispute. Sex sealed the deal. And so the pressure was enormous, especially on the bride. She was expected to be modest, reluctant, but ultimately yielding. Too eager, and she risked shame. Too hesitant, and she might be accused of sabotage. The groom, meanwhile, was expected to perform without fail. A failed bedding could lead to annulment, scandal, or worse, impotence trials. Yes, those existed. Let's say the groom claims the bride is cursed, or the bride claims the groom can't fulfill his duty. The church might step in and order a test. He'd be examined by experts, usually priests, sometimes midwives, who would judge whether he was physically capable. Sometimes in front of an audience. Sometimes with help. No, I'm not kidding. Historians still argue whether these trials were symbolic or actual courtroom spectacles, but multiple records show these verifications took place, usually with enough humiliation to last a lifetime. And if the groom passed? Great. Back to bed. If not? Well, the marriage could be annulled, and the bride sent back home. With or without her reputation intact. For peasants, things were simpler, but not necessarily less awkward. Bedding customs varied wildly. In some villages, the bride's family would parade her around town before giving her to the groom. In others, neighbors would break into the couple's home after midnight to sing bawdy songs, throw peas at them, or even clamber into bed with them, fully clothed, but definitely intrusive. Some customs included carrying the bride across the threshold while people chanted suggestive rhymes. Others involved symbolic acts, like breaking a loaf of bread over the bed, or placing a sword between the couple to cut through resistance. Metaphors were big in medieval marriage. But no matter the region, the idea was the same: get married, then get busy. Immediately. Preferably before the wine wore off. And yet, not everyone played along. There are tales of couples sneaking away to avoid the spectacle, consummating their marriage quietly under a tree or in a stable. One clever nobleman reportedly hired an actor to impersonate him for the bedding ceremony, just long enough to satisfy the witnesses before slipping away for a private night. Others, especially women, faced the bedding ceremony with dread. The idea of having your first sexual experience with an audience in the next room, or under pressure from your in-laws, was far from romantic. One noblewoman reportedly fainted at the edge of the bed and had to be revived with vinegar-soaked cloth before the bishop would agree the marriage had begun. And yet, some couples found ways to turn the moment into something tender. They whispered beneath the covers. They found humor in the awkwardness. They made pacts: let's just get through this and talk in the morning, and occasionally, against all odds, they fell in love right there, with chicken bones still on the floor and the neighbors still knocking on the shutters. Because beneath all the ritual, all the pressure, all the ridiculous formalities, there were still two people. Nervous. Curious. Hopeful. Or terrified. And the bedding ceremony? It wasn't just about sex. It was about transition, from youth to adulthood, from single to partnered, from uncertain to, hopefully, stable. Of course, it didn't always work. Marriages broke down. Annulments were sought. Some couples never consummated at all. And others consummated enthusiastically, then spent the next 20 years in quiet loathing. But for better or worse, the bedding ceremony marked the start. A moment where privacy became public theatre. Where flesh met law. Where every eye in the village looked toward a closed door, and imagined what came next. You wake up to the distant toll of a church bell, the smell of stale ale still clinging to your tunic, and the realization that you're married now, whether or not last night went according to plan. But love in the Middle Ages isn't just about feelings or fireworks or flirty parchment notes. It's about who you're allowed to marry in the first place. You roll over, glance at your new spouse, maybe a stranger, maybe a friend, and wonder, how did you end up with them? Because medieval matchmaking wasn't led by hearts. It was led by bloodlines, wallets, alliances, and a bewildering maze of canon law. Let's get this straight: you don't just marry whoever you fancy. Not unless you enjoy excommunication, lawsuits, or being used as a political pawn. Who could marry whom was dictated by your birth, your rank, your land, your religion, and sometimes even by how many goats your uncle once owed the bishop. The church had rules. So many rules. By the 12th century, canon law had expanded the idea of consanguinity, that is, blood relation, so far that you could be banned from marrying someone as distantly related as your seventh cousin. You needed a papal dispensation just to marry someone who shared a common ancestor 8 generations ago. Which, frankly, made things awkward for the nobility, who all shared a handful of great-grandpas. But don't worry. If you were rich enough, you could get that little scroll of papal permission and marry your cousin twice removed without batting an eye. If you weren't rich, well, enjoy your life of lonely chastity or illegal entanglements. And even if you weren't related, there were other complications. Say you're a peasant. You've fallen in love with a miller's daughter from the next village over. Problem: her father owes fealty to a different lord, and your marriage might transfer her labor to your lord's domain. Cue land disputes, tax confusion, and angry letters from people who wear too many rings. Or say you're a merchant's son, and you're smitten with a noble girl whose gowns cost more than your shop earns in a year. Lovely! Except, she legally can't marry below her station without her father's consent, and maybe not even then. Marrying down meant diluting bloodlines, losing dowries, or, worse, public disgrace. Historians still argue whether these restrictions were uniformly enforced or conveniently ignored depending on the local bishop's mood. In some towns, communities married freely, ignoring church edicts until someone got nosy. In others, the rules were gospel, literally, and a wrong match meant annulment and scandal. And then, there's love. Yes, it existed. People wrote poems, sang songs, whispered promises under fig trees. But love, more often than not, came after marriage, if it came at all. You married who you were told, and then, with luck, you grew fond of each other over the years, between plowing fields and birthing 9 children, 6 of whom wouldn't survive infancy. Still, people tried to sneak love in where they could. There are stories of young couples making secret promises before witnesses, effectively marrying themselves without church sanction. This was called clandestine marriage, and while it was technically valid, it caused chaos. No priest, no paperwork, no parental consent. Just a quiet vow, I take thee, said under a tree or by a river. Romantic, yes. Legally disastrous, also yes. To combat this, the church started requiring marriages to be announced in advance, the bans. For 3 Sundays in a row, your name would be read aloud in church, giving anyone who objected time to speak up. That old boyfriend? That angry cousin? That priest who really didn't like you? They all had their chance. Of course, the rules were easier to bend for men. A nobleman could take a lover, father a few unnatural children, and still make a politically sound marriage later. A woman? Not so much. Her purity was currency, and if it was spent before marriage, her value dropped like a plague-infected rat. Quirky fact, in some cases, couples could be forced to marry if caught being a little too cozy in public. One 13th-century French town had a rule that if a man and woman were found lying in suspicious arrangement in a barn, the local magistrate could order a wedding within 24 hours. Surprise, you're hitched. Dowries were another layer in this complicated web. A dowry wasn't just a gift, it was a transaction. A woman's family paid her husband to take her off their hands, essentially. The bigger the dowry, the better the match. And if she died without bearing children, that dowry often had to be returned. Marriages were business deals with emotional side effects. The reverse existed too, the dower, property set aside for the wife's support if her husband died. Because yes, the medieval world assumed your husband would die before you. Possibly in a war. Possibly in a duel. Possibly from eating something suspiciously green. But not all marriages were cold-blooded contracts. There are surviving letters full of affection and admiration. Husbands writing home with longing. Wives managing estates with skill and sass. Couples who, through luck or miracle, actually liked each other. In fact, courtly love, especially among the nobility, sometimes existed alongside marriage, not within it. A knight might pledge himself to a married lady, vowing to serve her with devotion and poetry, while never touching her. Or so the theory went. In reality? historians still debate how many of these flirtations stayed poetic. Of course, not everyone got married. Some joined the church. Some joined brothels. Some joined no one and lived as spinsters, confirmed bachelors, or quietly queer individuals on society's fringe. But for those who did marry, and did so within the labyrinthine rules of canon law, feudal obligation, and social rank, it was rarely a choice made freely. It was a choice made correctly. Because in the end, love wasn't the point. Order was. So as you lie next to your newly betrothed, chosen not for their laugh, but for their lineage, you might wonder if love will come. And maybe, one day, while mucking the stables or kneading bread together in quiet companionship, it will. And if not? There's always the fig tree. And that one smile from the miller's daughter. The one you weren't supposed to remember. The fire crackles low in the hearth, casting long, dancing shadows across the stone floor of your new chamber. You're not in a cottage anymore. You're in a castle. Or maybe a manor house. Somewhere with windows, glass windows, even, and wall hangings to stop the wind from whistling straight through the stones. You're married now. Nobly. Politically. Officially. But the bed you're about to climb into isn't just a bed. It's a throne, a negotiation table, and a potential battlefield. Tonight, we're slipping under the velvet canopy of noble bedrooms, where sex was rarely about pleasure and almost always about power. Let's set the scene. You, dear listener, are a noble, male or female, doesn't matter. Either way, you probably didn't get to choose your spouse. Your parents did. Maybe when you were still chasing ducks barefoot through the orchard. The marriage was arranged years ago, likely while you were busy not dying of dysentery. The wedding was grand, church bells, feast, minstrels, but now it's just the two of you. And this bed, large enough to sleep a family of goats, covered in imported linens and strewn with symbols of fertility, fruits, flowers, perhaps a ceremonial sword. Everything in this room whispers of status. And status matters. Because who you lie with, and how you lie with them, can change the course of kingdoms. The noble bedroom was never just private. Behind those heavy curtains, lineage was forged. Sons were begotten. Claims were strengthened. Think of it less as romance, and more as dynastic infrastructure. But that doesn't mean nobles didn't enjoy themselves. They just had to multitask while doing it. A tryst with your spouse might be your duty. A tryst with your lover? That was the perk. Many noble marriages were open secrets. A husband and wife would perform their public duties, attend court, raise heirs, pose for illuminated manuscripts, while privately taking lovers, mistresses, and, occasionally, discreet same-sex companions. The French court, especially, was legendary for its romantic chaos. Queen Isabeau of Bavaria was rumored to have multiple affairs while her husband, Charles VI, wandered the halls claiming he was made of glass. Historians still argue whether the rumors were slander or survival tactics, but either way, noble bedrooms were not always monogamous. Quirky fact, noble women were sometimes expected to remain chaste until their first child was born. After that, the pressure eased. Because as long as the first heir was official, nobody looked too closely at the rest. Well, not until they started fighting over inheritances. Now, let's talk logistics. Noble beds were enormous, not just for comfort, but to impress. A towering four-poster bed said, "I am powerful and probably not dying of rickets." It also made space for bedfellows. And not those kinds, actual bedfellows. In many noble courts, attendants slept at the foot of the bed. Servants hovered behind curtains. You might never be truly alone, not even naked. So privacy was negotiable. Still, nobles got creative. Secret staircases, garden alcoves, hunting lodges, these became rendezvous spots for passion that couldn't be expressed under chandeliers. One countess reportedly built a system of secret bells to alert her lover when the coast was clear. Another hired a maid to impersonate her while she snuck out in disguise. Affairs among nobles were risky but common. The higher your status, the greater your visibility, and the more delicate your secrets. A nobleman caught with a chambermaid might be laughed off. A noblewoman caught with a squire could trigger exile, annulment, or worse, confinement in a convent with only psalms for company. And yet, some pulled it off. Eleanor of Aquitaine famously defied expectations. Married first to Louis VII of France, then to Henry II of England, she navigated politics, passion, and power with more skill than most of her male counterparts. Her relationships weren't just strategic, they were legendary. Then there's the case of John of Gaunt, who had a decades-long affair with Catherine Swynford, his mistress and eventual wife. Their children, born out of wedlock, were later legitimized and became ancestors to the Tudors. So yes, sometimes, love won. But it wasn't all poetic rebellion. In many noble marriages, sex was a duty. A grim obligation performed under pressure to produce heirs. If you were lucky, your spouse was kind. If not, you clenched your jaw, recited a psalm, and hoped it would be over quickly. Marital rape wasn't a concept the law recognized. A noble woman was expected to submit her body, her fertility, her silence. If she refused, she could be cast as disobedient or mad. Her lands might be seized. Her children taken. Autonomy was fragile, especially in bed. And yet, women found ways to resist. Some used herbs, abortifacients disguised as digestive teas. Others feigned illness or took long pilgrimages. Some cultivated religious devotion to deflect their husband's desires. One abbess-turned-aristocrat reportedly wore a hair shirt under her gown as a deterrent to her overly amorous husband. Romantic. Still, passion existed. Even in arranged marriages, affection could bloom. One 15th-century nobleman wrote letters to his wife describing how her absence made his limbs heavy and his thoughts clouded. Another woman, locked away during a rebellion, smuggled love notes to her imprisoned husband in hollowed-out loaves of bread. So what happened after the bedroom? Well, if all went according to plan, pregnancy. And then the whole thing started again. Noble women were expected to bear child after child, regardless of their health. Their value was tied to their womb, their loyalty, and their ability to hold the household together, which usually meant managing staff, hosting guests, and quietly pretending her husband wasn't flirting with the minstrel. Noblemen, meanwhile, could gain prestige through sexual conquest, as long as they didn't upset the wrong alliances. Sleeping with the wrong duchess could spark a war. Sleeping with the right one could make you a duke. And for those who remained celibate? There were always rumors. A man who never married might be called devoted to God, or whispered about behind tapestries. A woman who refused suitors might be called a witch, a saint, or just very particular about dowries. Because in noble circles, sex was never just about desire. It was about narrative. And everyone, from the cook to the king, was watching. So tonight, as you pull those heavy curtains closed and extinguish the last candle, you lie beside your spouse, or your lover, or perhaps both. You whisper a few words, not for prayer, but for protection. Because in this world, love is power. And the bedroom? That's where kingdoms are born. You're not in a castle anymore. Tonight, the stars peek through the slats of a thatched roof, the floor is packed earth, and the only luxuries are a pile of hay and maybe a carved wooden spoon that hasn't been licked by the dog. Welcome to the peasant's bedroom, if you can even call it that. Because for the vast majority of medieval people, sex didn't happen in canopied beds or behind velvet curtains. It happened in cramped cottages, communal barns, or out in the fields when no one was looking. Or, sometimes, when everyone was looking and politely pretended not to. In a medieval village, privacy was about as real as unicorns. Homes were usually single-room dwellings, shared by the entire family, children, parents, sometimes grandparents, and yes, animals. Chickens clucked in the corners. Goats milled about. If you were lucky, the pig stayed outside. If you were really lucky, your parents didn't time their nighttime coughing fits for when you were trying to sleep. Still, couples found ways. A corner of the room with a curtain. A quick trip to the woodshed. A midday break when the fields were empty and everyone else was busy trying not to die of cold or hunger. The phrase "making hay while the sun shines" had a whole other meaning when you were literally doing it in the hayloft. Unlike nobles, peasants didn't always wait for marriage. In many communities, sex before wedlock was frowned upon, but not shocking. If you were handfast or betrothed, a little premarital canoodling was often quietly tolerated. After all, how else were you supposed to test whether the person you were about to marry snored like a dying ox? And yes, pregnancies happened. All the time. Illegitimate births weren't uncommon, especially in villages where everyone knew everyone and pretended not to. Local priests might turn a blind eye until they didn't. Then came the public penance. A barefoot walk through the village. A confession shouted at the church door. Or a fine paid in chickens, grain, or a few months of extra labor. But even within these tight-knit communities, there were standards. A couple might be forced to marry if the girl became pregnant. Or the man might be hauled before the local manorial court to acknowledge paternity. Sometimes, he'd be ordered to pay child support, paid, of course, in sacks of barley or an extra cow if he had one to spare. Still, among the lower classes, sex was often less regulated by law and more by logistics. People did what they had to. Life was hard. Days were long. And if you could steal a moment of pleasure, under the stars, behind the bakehouse, you took it. Historians still debate just how permissive peasant society was. Some argue that rural communities had an unofficial tolerance for casual relationships, so long as no one caused scandal. Others insist that strict norms governed every aspect of sexuality. The truth? Likely somewhere in between. Rules existed, but they bent like a cartwheel in the mud. Let's not pretend it was all romantic. Sex in peasant life could be transactional. A landlord might demand favors in return for lower rent. A widow might trade her affection for protection. Some girls, barely in their teens, were married off to older men to cement family ties or settle debts. And coercion, unfortunately, was as common then as it is now, just less likely to be called by name. But it wasn't all bleak. There are accounts of deep love among peasants, couples who stayed together for decades, raising children and sheep, surviving winters and fevers, and still sneaking off into the woods for stolen kisses. A 14th-century English ballad describes a ploughman writing love songs to his wife on birch bark. Not because he had to. Because he wanted to. And the humor? Oh, it was earthy. Medieval peasant humor about sex was blunt, crass, and delightfully rude. Jokes about hayforks and carrots. Songs about maidens milking the wrong goat. Folk tales that involved shape-shifting lovers, enchanted underpants, and bedposts that talked. It wasn't subtle, but it was shared, laughed at, and passed down like treasured secrets. Quirky fact, in some villages, there were ritualized courtship games. One involved a young man sneaking into a girl's house at night and lying beside her in bed, fully clothed, to test compatibility. If the girl objected, he left. If not, the implication was clear. This was called night visiting, and yes, it was a thing. And while church doctrine loomed, it loomed less intensely over the peasants than over the gentry. Rural priests had bigger fish to fry, like keeping the roof from collapsing or surviving the next crop failure. A young couple caught rolling in the hay might receive a stern lecture, or a wink, depending on the priest's own Saturday night. Still, if scandal brewed too hot, local officials could take action. A woman known for having too many visitors might be called to court. A man who left a trail of pregnant girls might be whipped or exiled. And if you crossed into serious offense territory, adultery, incest, or sleeping with someone your lord had reserved, you'd better pack a bag. Or at least bring extra grain for the bribe. But for most, sex was simple. Quick. Necessary. And, surprisingly, sometimes joyful. The barn may not have had silk sheets, but it had moonlight, laughter, and the promise of something warmer than the frost outside. You roll over now, lying on your side in a shared bed, your spouse's feet icy and your pillow made of stuffed linen. A child stirs nearby. The hearth glows faintly. Outside, the cows shuffle. And in that quiet, exhausted moment, there's a strange kind of comfort. Because for all the hardship, all the rules and gossip, the peasant's bedroom was alive. Full of awkward beginnings, whispered jokes, silent understanding. And sometimes, love. It's market day. The streets are buzzing with barefoot children, chicken feathers, and the distant sound of someone hawking cabbage like it's the cure for the plague. You squeeze past a wheelbarrow, duck under a laundry line, and stop outside a building with red-painted doors and faint music drifting from within. This isn't just a tavern. It's a brothel. And yes, the church knows it's here. In fact, they might have even approved it. Tonight, we're stepping into the smoky, sweet-scented world of medieval sex work, a world both reviled and regulated, forbidden yet strategically tolerated. Let's say you walk through the brothel door. Immediately, you're greeted with warmth. Actual warmth. There's a fire going, which is already better than your cottage, and the smell of honey wine, lavender oil, and bodies that, for once, don't smell like turnips. A girl leans on a carved wooden railing above the entryway. She's smiling, but her eyes are tired. The music picks up, a soft pluck of strings, and someone's laughing in a curtained alcove. This, dear listener, is the stew, a nickname for bathhouses and brothels alike, because everything was hot, steamy, and slightly suspicious. Sex work in the Middle Ages existed in a strange liminal space, officially condemned by the church, but quietly allowed to function as a necessary evil. The thinking went like this: better for lustful men to pay for sin than to corrupt innocent maidens or, heaven forbid, commit unnatural acts. So, welcome to the medieval version of harm reduction. In cities like London, Paris, and Florence, brothels were licensed. That's right, licensed. They had operating hours, fees, even dress codes. In some areas, sex workers were required to wear a yellow hood or sash to identify their profession. Others were forbidden from entering churches, or only allowed in the back. It was legal, but never respectable. Quirky fact, in some towns, brothel workers had their own guilds. Not as prestigious as blacksmiths or masons, sure, but organized all the same. They paid taxes, filed grievances, lobbied for better treatment. Some even formed sisterhoods that offered basic healthcare or burial services. Historians still argue whether these women were empowered or exploited. On one hand, sex work offered financial independence. A poor woman might earn more in a week than a laundress maid in a month. On the other hand, it came with danger, violence, disease, and the constant threat of arrest if public morals shifted. And yet, the brothels thrived. Often right under the church's nose. In Avignon, during the 14th century, while it was the seat of the papacy, there were hundreds of sex workers operating in open view of cardinals and monks. One even joked, in writing, that the sin is always forgiven on Sundays. Well, isn't that convenient? The clientele? Everyone. Merchants. Knights. Students. Even clergy. Especially clergy. In one famous case, a bishop was caught mid-visit and tried to escape wearing the brothel madam's cloak. He claimed it was penance. Nobody believed him. And the sex workers? They weren't just nameless faces behind curtains. Some were educated. Some owned property. Some formed deep, long-term relationships with clients who treated them more kindly than their own spouses. Take La Belle Heloise, a Parisian courtesan known for her wit and sharp tongue. She once told a pompous bishop, "I know your sins better than you do. Shall I whisper them to the crowd?" He paid double. But not all women entered the trade by choice. Some were trafficked, sold by their families, or lured by false promises of domestic work. Others were driven by desperation, widows with no income, abandoned girls with no protection, women deemed ruined and thus unfit for marriage. And yet, within the brothel, there was a strange hierarchy. At the top, the courtesans, educated, well-dressed, often kept by nobles or wealthy merchants. They read poetry, played music, and offered company and conversation. Some were treated almost like wives, just without the paperwork. Below them were the stewsmaids, those who worked in licensed bathhouses, often forced to rotate through clients-like shifts at a bakery. And at the bottom? The streetwalkers. The light skirts. The women on corners and in alleyways, vulnerable to every cruelty and protected by no one. Medieval society couldn't decide whether to pity or punish them. One year, city officials might host a public flogging of fallen women. The next, they'd quietly use brothel taxes to repair a church roof. Some towns even designated specific buildings, funded by the town council, to house sex workers safely. There were attempts at reform. In some regions, laws were passed to shut down red light districts, ban public solicitation, or rehabilitate women through forced monastic service. But these efforts rarely lasted. Demand never disappeared. And where there's demand, there's always supply, albeit in more secret, and often more dangerous, forms. And don't think the industry was entirely heterosexual. Though it was riskier, there were whispered tales of same-sex brothels, quiet establishments where men met other men, or women found companionship outside the narrow script of marriage. These places were deeply underground, often protected by bribes or powerful patrons. But they existed. And they mattered. Some brothels even had rules of decorum. No fighting. No drunken destruction. No bedding someone against their will. Break the rules, and you'd be thrown out, if not worse. Because even in the darkest corners, there were lines that couldn't be crossed. At least, not openly. So now, as you sit in the brothel parlor, sipping a cup of spiced wine handed to you by someone who knows every secret in town, you begin to see the truth. Sex work in the Middle Ages wasn't just a vice. It was a mirror. It reflected everything: poverty, power, politics, and the fragile morality of a church that condemned desire even as it quietly profited from it. And for the women who lived it? It was survival. Sometimes bitter. Sometimes brutal. Sometimes, unexpectedly, beautiful. Because in a world that offered few choices, they carved out their own kind of agency, one whispered deal, one candlelit glance, one forbidden kiss at a time. You duck behind a hedge as the town watch passes, their torches flickering like nervous fireflies in the misty dark. You're not doing anything illegal, at least, not yet. You're just wearing a tunic that doesn't quite belong to your gender, walking with a sway that's either deliberate or deeply authentic, and headed toward a gathering that isn't exactly listed on the town's event calendar. Tonight, we're stepping into a world rarely illuminated by candlelight or chroniclers: gender fluidity and cross-dressing desire in medieval times. Yes, you heard right. While the official line was rigid, 2 genders, 2 roles, period, the reality, as usual, was far more complicated. Behind the monastery walls, beyond the castle's glare, and in the bustling anonymity of medieval cities, people were bending, blurring, and outright ignoring the rules of gender expression. And it wasn't always just about clothes. Let's start with the cross-dressers, because they're the easiest for medieval society to spot and obsess over. There are dozens of recorded cases of women dressing as men, usually to gain access to spaces or freedoms denied to them. Some cut their hair short, donned male armor or tunics, and lived for years without detection. In most official accounts, they were eventually found out and punished, or forgiven, if they'd done it for sufficiently noble reasons. One woman, Joan of Arc, ring a bell, was burned not solely for heresy, but in large part because she refused to stop wearing men's clothing. Even after being told it was a sin, even after being threatened with death, she insisted the clothes were a matter of spiritual necessity and practical safety. And for that, among other reasons, she went to the stake. But Joan wasn't alone. In fact, the Church's rulebook, known as Summa Theologica, had a whole section about it. Is it sinful for a woman to wear man's attire? Asked Thomas Aquinas. Yes, he answered, predictably, unless there is a just cause. Like battle. Or hiding from pirates. Or, divine visions. Historians still argue whether cross-dressing was always just a disguise for survival, or, at least sometimes, a genuine expression of identity. Some figures who lived as another gender for decades show up in church records not as sinners, but as curiosities. One brother Marina, born as a woman, became a monk and lived as a man for most of their adult life. When their identity was discovered, after death, the monastery simply buried them in full clerical garb and quietly moved on. Which leads us to a key point: medieval society noticed gender nonconformity, but didn't always agree on what to do about it. Quirky fact? There were laws on the books forbidding transvestitism, but enforcement varied wildly. A woman caught wearing a man's clothing might be flogged in one town and offered a job in another. Men who wore dresses as a joke were usually laughed off unless they were suspected of actually enjoying it. Because the line between jest and desire was thin and dangerous. In carnivals and festivals, gender play was not only allowed, it was celebrated. Men dressed as women. Women dressed as men. Roles were inverted. May Day parades often featured boys in flower crowns and girls wielding swords. The temporary chaos was sanctioned, even expected. But once the feast was over, order had to return. Unless, of course, it didn't. In secret, in shadows, people lived beyond the binaries. In city neighborhoods with enough anonymity, or in traveling troupes of actors, musicians, and misfits, gender fluidity thrived. There are whispered accounts of individuals who never returned to their assigned roles, living in self-made identities long before the language to describe them existed. And sex? Well, that made everything even messier. There were relationships where gender presentation was part of the attraction, men who sought out masculine-presenting women, women drawn to effeminate men, and couples who used clothing to switch roles entirely during intimacy. While hard to document directly, thanks to centuries of censorship and shredded pages, these dynamics show up in coded poems, courtroom rumors, and, occasionally, wildly inappropriate stained glass margins. Take the case of a Flemish woman in the 15th century who dressed as a man to marry another woman. When discovered, she insisted she was as capable as any husband and had done nothing wrong. Her lover agreed. The town court did not. They were exiled. But they vanished into history as a legend, retold in whispers. Of course, cross-dressing wasn't always sexual or identity-based. Sometimes it was political protest. A statement. A way to thumb your nose at a rigid system. Women donned armor and took up swords to defend towns. Men wore dresses to avoid conscription. Clothing was power, and medieval folks knew it. The church, for its part, kept squirming. Clergy condemned gender nonconformity in sermons while chuckling at it during carnival. They wrote condemnations of sodomy, yet recorded stories of saints who blurred gender entirely, like Saint Wilgefortis, a bearded woman crucified for refusing to marry a man. Devotion, in her case, came with facial hair and gender confusion. She was venerated nonetheless. Because sometimes, contradiction was built right into the system. You could condemn the sin and love the person. You could enforce the rule and then wink when someone broke it. You could fear difference and still be moved by it. Historians still debate the intent of many cross-dressing figures. Were they trans in the modern sense, or just pragmatic rebels? The records are cloudy, distorted by clerics, chroniclers, and centuries of bias. But one thing is clear: gender fluidity wasn't invented yesterday. It existed. It confused people. And sometimes, it delighted them too. So as you walk through the night, dressed in someone else's skin, hair tied back, boots laced high, you feel a strange freedom. You're not hiding. You're becoming. Not a sin. Not a scandal. Just yourself, in a world that doesn't quite have the words for you yet. But give it time. They'll catch up. You step into the back corner of a candlelit tavern, where the air smells like spilled ale and old secrets, and find yourself in the company of glances that last a little too long. Here, in the warm shadows, someone brushes your hand, not by accident. There's a flicker of risk, yes, but also recognition. Tonight, you're drifting quietly into a space history often tries to erase: same-sex love in the medieval world. Contrary to what textbooks might suggest, queerness didn't begin in the 20th century. In fact, it didn't even pause in the Middle Ages. It simply wore different names, hid in different places, and sometimes, when no one was looking, sang at the top of its lungs in the form of poetry, prayer, or a dangerous kiss behind the churchyard wall. So let's get one thing out of the way early: the church said no. Homosexual acts were condemned as a sin against nature. Sodomy was lumped in with bestiality and other unmentionables in legal codes across Europe. Punishments ranged from fasting and flogging to exile or execution, though in practice, these were often reserved for those who dared to be too open about it, or who attracted political attention. But between those fire and brimstone proclamations, real lives unfolded, complex, vibrant, and stubbornly unrepentant. Take the love letters between medieval monks. Some are awkwardly coded. Others are not. One writes of another's eyes like spring sky and hands that tremble the soul. These weren't just friendly notes about crop yields. These were declarations. Risks taken with ink. Historians still argue whether these letters were evidence of romance, deep platonic brotherhood, or something more nuanced. The term homosexual didn't exist yet, not as an identity. But actions, affections, desires? Oh, those existed. Loudly, sometimes. In noble courts, especially in France and Italy, male companionship could be so close that it blurred every line. Poets like Richard de Fournival and Guido Cavalcanti wrote verses to their beloveds that brimmed with passion, obsession, and very thinly veiled eroticism. And no one ripped the parchment from their hands. Why? Because it was often written off as courtly admiration. A chaste devotion. You could pledge your soul to another man, as long as you claimed it was metaphorical. Quirky fact, in 14th century France, there were documented same-sex marriage ceremonies. Yes, actual rituals, held in churches, where two men would make vows, kiss the pax, and share bread and wine. They called it adelphopoiesis, or brother-making. Officially Platonic, but often seen by contemporaries as much more. Church authorities alternated between tolerating it and pretending it didn't exist. Because to acknowledge it too loudly was to admit how many people desired outside the mold. And it wasn't just men. Medieval records mention women living together in what later scholars dubbed Boston marriages, shared lives, shared beds, and lifelong devotion. Some women formed what looked a lot like marriages, taking vows to each other in private, swapping rings, and even filing legal documents to co-own property. These relationships were often written off as safe, even quaint, because surely, women couldn't possibly, right? Spoiler, they absolutely could. There's a famous case from 15th century France of a woman named Jean, who dressed in men's clothing, called herself Jean, and married another woman. When discovered, she claimed divine instruction and refused to renounce the marriage. The court eventually ruled that the couple must separate, but not before their bond became town legend. The line between identity and behavior was fuzzier then. You could be a priest who had a close friendship with an altar boy and still keep your collar, if you were discreet. But if your relationship became public knowledge? That's when the hammer came down. Not for feeling, but for flaunting. So how did people keep these relationships hidden? Carefully. Code words in letters. Poetry full of fruit and fire. Assigning each other scent names. Meeting in the bathhouse, the alehouse, the woods. One man carved his lover's name into the bark of a tree outside town, then disguised it as a prayer. Even saints weren't spared the speculation. Saint Ulrad of Rivaux, a 12th century English abbot, wrote tenderly of his male companions, describing their sweet embrace and unity of souls. Was it spiritual brotherhood? Possibly. Was it something more? Well, the language practically blushes. And then there were the punishments. If you were caught, you could be shamed, whipped, fined, or worse. A man in Florence might be branded. A woman in Germany might be banished. In some regions, male lovers were drowned in barrels or burned alive. Female lovers, less commonly punished, were sometimes forced into marriage or convents. Yet despite the risk, people loved. They risked everything for a touch, a letter, a midnight visit. They dreamed of lives where love didn't need hiding. And sometimes, they found ways to live those lives anyway. Not all stories ended in tragedy. Some queer people lived quietly, surrounded by chosen family. Some thrived as artists, abbesses, court jesters, or wandering minstrels. Some found protection in power, patrons who looked the other way, lords with their own secrets. And some lived out their days with the person they loved, buried side by side in a quiet grave no one ever questioned. The medieval world didn't have the vocabulary we use today, no LGBTQ acronyms, no pride flags fluttering from castle towers. But it had people yearning, risking, inventing lives outside the script. So as you sip your wine in the back of that tavern, your fingers brushing someone else's, you know the truth. Love always finds a way. Even when the laws say no. Even when the priests look angry. Even when history tries to forget. Love writes its own history. In margins. In shadows. In whispers. But also, sometimes, when no one's watching, in light. You find yourself in a chapel, not a grand, stained glass cathedral, but a modest one, tucked behind cloisters, with stone benches worn smooth by centuries of knees. The monk leading prayers hums through Latin verses, his voice low and even, but your eyes drift downward, to the underside of the choir stall, and you blink. Wait, is that a monkey spanking a bishop? Yes. Yes, it is. Tonight, you're peering into the secret corners of medieval manuscripts and cathedral carvings, places where piety met perversion in the most unexpected ways. Welcome to the mischievous world of kinky scrolls and naughty manuscripts, where monks had quills, imaginations, and apparently no adult supervision. Let's be clear, the Middle Ages were devout. People feared hellfire, paid indulgences, wore hair shirts. But just as real? Their sense of humor, their curiosity, and their surprisingly casual attitude about slipping a pair of disembodied buttocks into the margins of the Book of Psalms. This wasn't hidden on private pages, either. These were public books, used in monasteries, courts, and churches. And someone, many someones, decided that alongside sacred text, what the world really needed was an image of a man kissing a snail's behind. Or two nuns fighting with exposed bellies. Or a disapproving rabbit wielding a sword while standing on another rabbit's, well. Let's just say it wasn't exactly PG. Historians still argue whether these images were satire, subconscious venting, or some monk's slow descent into bored insanity after copying "Blessed is the man" for the 10,000th time. Whatever the reason, the results were unforgettable. And we have a name for them, marginalia. These weren't just doodles. They were part of the manuscript culture, small scenes, sometimes fantastical, sometimes deeply inappropriate, hidden in the margins of sacred books, secular texts, and illuminated manuscripts. Think of it as the medieval version of internet comment sections. But drawn. With gold leaf. An occasional nudity. The creators? Mostly monks, scribes, and artists, often working for wealthy patrons. Some were anonymous. Some signed their names. All of them had to sit, hunched over wooden desks, in silence, for hours a day, while trying not to lose their minds. So maybe it's no surprise that weirdness slipped in. One book of hours, a popular personal prayer book, included a series of illustrations showing a knight being disrobed by apes. Another features a bishop riding a bear, while two frogs juggle sausages in the background. There's zero theological reason for this. But someone took the time to ink every single hairy detail. Quirky fact? Some scholars believe these images were part of an inside joke, a visual wink shared between scribe and reader. Others think it was a form of resistance, a way for lower-class artists to subtly mock the elite clergy. Still others insist it was all deeply symbolic. Though frankly, I'm not sure what a fox playing the bagpipes on his own rear symbolizes. Maybe multitasking? And it wasn't just men at play. Female scribes existed, rare but real, and some of the most eyebrow-raising images appear in books commissioned by noble women. One aristocratic lady had a personal prayer book illuminated with images of naked people inside the letter forms. Was it scandal? Or just style? The truth is, sexuality was never fully hidden in medieval art. It just wore elaborate disguises. Take the Roman de la Rose, a widely popular 13th century poem about love, lust, and botanical metaphors. It was illustrated with gardens of desire, allegorical figures with disturbingly suggestive fruit, and fountains that were very obviously not just fountains. There are bestiaries, too, books of animals, real and imagined. Sure, they include moral lessons, like be humble, like the ant. But also, dolphins mating. Monkeys with erections. A whole section about how beavers bite off their own testicles to escape hunters. Which, frankly, seems like a dramatic overreaction. Then you have misericords, the small folding seats in church choir stalls. Carved underneath, hidden from view unless you knelt down, were scenes that would make a bishop blush, men mooning each other, pigs in nuns' habits, and one particularly daring carving of a couple engaging in very close conversation behind a grapevine. So why all the cheekiness? One theory is that the juxtaposition made the sacred even more sacred. By surrounding holy text with the absurd, you heightened its contrast, like framing a jewel with tarnished metal. Another theory? Human nature. If you've ever passed notes in math class, you understand. Even today, we find ourselves drawn to humor in high places. If a politician slips on a banana peel, we laugh. If a monk draws a but in a gospel book, we remember it. There's also the theory of the monastic mind, that monks, repressed by vows and endless silence, found relief through illustration. Not rebellion, exactly. More like release. A harmless act of disobedience, tucked in the margins, where only the curious would see. And sex? Always lurking. Not explicit, but suggested. Bodies tangled in vines. Lovers with ambiguous anatomy. Creatures wrestling in positions suspiciously advanced for creatures who supposedly can't read. The implication was clear. Pleasure existed, even in sacred books. Even in sacred minds. Some monks wrote poems to imaginary lovers in the empty pages of prayer books. Some added sighing lovers to the background of apocalypse scenes. Some, one monk carved a man defecating on a battlefield. It wasn't sexy. But it was very human. Which is the point, really. These marginalia remind us that medieval people weren't saints walking on air. They were messy, funny, contradictory. They lit candles for their sins, and then giggled while drawing naked frogs in the dark. So the next time you see a solemn medieval book behind glass in a museum, look closer. Maybe, just maybe, in the corner of a gilded P, you'll see a knight being chased by a snail with a human face. And you'll know, someone, long ago, was bored, brilliant, and just naughty enough to make sure you'd laugh 800 years later. It starts with a whisper. A bottle pass beneath the table. A crumbled pouch of dried herbs tucked into the hem of a dress. Tonight, someone's brewing a lust potion, and hoping it doesn't kill them. You've stumbled into the fragrant, fascinating, and slightly dangerous world of medieval aphrodisiacs, herbal charms, and love curses. Because when desire was outlawed, or at least tightly controlled, people did what they always do, turn to the dirt, the stars, and the nearest gossip-prone apothecary. You're in a market now, pretending to browse onions, but your real interest is in the woman by the fountain with 6 teeth, 3 cats, and a reputation for helping lovers. She sells bundles of herbs wrapped in cloth, nettle, saffron, yarrow, and murmurs, boil this in milk. Drink it warm. Don't let your mother see. This, dear listener, is medieval love magic. Equal parts hopeful, herbal, and hilariously unscientific. Let's start with the potions. There was no shortage of ingredients believed to spark desire: cinnamon, cloves, honey, fennel, mint. Saffron, in particular, was seen as powerful, if you could afford it. Not only did it make your food glow like gold, it was said to warm the blood, which was the polite medieval way of saying excite the loins. Then there was rocket, no, not the spaceship kind. It's a plant, also known as arugula, and it shows up in medieval texts as a provoker of lust and courage. Salad has never sounded so seductive. But it didn't stop there. Animal products made frequent, disturbing appearances. Powdered deer antler. Dried rooster combs. Even, brace yourself, a concoction involving snail slime and goat testicles soaked in vinegar. Historians still argue whether anyone actually drank that or just claimed they did to sound brave. One Italian manual recommended a love electuary made of sugar, cinnamon, ginger, galangal, and ambergris, yes, the whale vomit stuff. Another warned against overuse, too much would cause nosebleeds, excessive weeping, or spontaneous poetry. Possibly all three at once. Quirky fact? In some regions, a popular love charm involved writing your beloved's name on a piece of bread, eating half, and feeding the rest to a bird. If the bird returned? True love. If it pooped on your head? Try again. Of course, not all love spells were gentle. Jealousy brought out the darker arts. Curses. Bindings. One Spanish grimoire describes how to make a frozen heart talisman to keep your rival from being desired. Ingredients: black ink, a dead bat, and a secret word you whisper while spitting 3 times into the wind. Romantic. And if you really wanted someone to fall for you, some spells got creative. There's a recipe from 15th century England that involves taking the sweat from your armpit, mixing it with rose water, and dabbing it on your beloved's pillow. Because nothing says be mine forever like odor elbow. But love magic wasn't just the realm of shady vendors and ambitious housewives. Even respected medical texts dabbled in it. The Trocula, a famous set of medieval writings on women's health, included recipes for increasing libido and rekindling marital joy. Some involved soaking herbs in wine. Others advised wearing specific stones, a carnelian, sapphire, jet, close to the skin, especially near the groin. Naturally. Astrology also played a role. Want to win someone's heart? Do it on a Friday, under the influence of Venus, when the moon is waxing. Need to break a love curse? Burn sage during a lunar eclipse and bury the ashes at a crossroads. Simple. As long as you had a working knowledge of planetary alignments, which most people didn't. Still, belief was powerful. If a girl gave a boy a ribbon tied 9 times under a full moon while thinking of his name, and he happened to glance at her the next day, obviously the spell had worked. But desire's a double-edged sword. What if you made someone love you too much? Or what if you wanted to undo affection? Enter the apotropaic charms, love repellents. One involved tying a clove of garlic in your boot to turn away uninvited suitors. Another said to wear a dried beetle in a pouch around your neck to ward off obsession. It may have worked through smell alone. And then there were the love filters used within marriage, to spark fading passion, ensure fidelity, or keep a husband from wandering too far into the next village's tavern. One wife mixed powdered thyme into her husband's soup every Thursday. Another sang a specific song while brushing her hair with a comb carved by her grandfather, ritual passed down from a grandmother who once seduced a knight with nothing but mutton stew and the right look. But not everyone approved of these tactics. The church, unsurprisingly, condemned love magic as sinful and dangerous. It blurred the line between lust and sorcery, 2 things that already made them nervous. Using herbs to spice up your marriage was tolerated. Using herbs to manipulate someone else's will? That was flirting with heresy. Inquisitors kept detailed records of trials where love magic was involved. One young woman in Germany was accused of causing a man's impotence with a cursed apple. Another, in France, supposedly carved her lover's name into a candle and melted it while whispering, "Only me, only me." When he returned to her, coincidentally, her neighbors promptly accused her of witchcraft. But prosecution was inconsistent. Sometimes love magic was treated as folk tradition, especially if practiced by midwives or elder women. Other times, it became a scapegoat. Your husband's distant? Must be a hex. Your daughter's run off with the stable boy? Clearly bewitched. Even nobility dabbled. Court records mention queens commissioning charms to keep their kings loyal during campaigns. One duchess in Italy paid a small fortune for a fertility elixir that turned out to be honey and saffron mixed with very expensive lies. And yet, the practice endured. People wanted love. They wanted control. They wanted assurance that something, be it mint tea or planetary positioning, was guiding their hearts toward what they hoped was happiness. So as you stir your own midnight mixture, rosemary, a strand of hair, maybe just a dash of cinnamon, you whisper your wish to the fire. Will it work? Maybe. Or maybe, like everyone else for 1,000 years, you'll hope just enough to believe it might. It's just before dawn, and the chapel is still. A pale shaft of light spills through the stained glass window, painting the stone floor with a mosaic of gold, red, and deep blue. Incense lingers in the air, sweet, smoky, and somewhere nearby, someone is weeping. But not from sorrow. From rapture. Tonight, we step into a place where flesh and spirit blur, the strange, intoxicating intersection of virgin saints and martyrgasms. Yes, you heard that right, and the ecstatic, often erotic language of medieval spirituality. You kneel beside a carved wooden statue of a young woman, crown of roses, eyes lifted skyward, hands delicately clasped. She's beautiful, peaceful, and bleeding from the neck. Welcome to sainthood, medieval style. The Middle Ages adored virgin martyrs. From Saint Agnes to Saint Cecilia, these women were revered not just for dying, but for dying pure. Virginity, when combined with suffering, became a shortcut to holiness. The more painful the death, the more radiant the afterlife. And for the devout, imagining these stories wasn't just spiritual, it was emotional, physical, and occasionally, a little too vivid. Take Saint Agatha. She was tortured for rejecting a Roman official's advances. Her breasts were cut off, cheerfully depicted in paintings where she holds them on a platter like a grim hors d'oeuvre, and yet, she is shown smiling, glowing with divine ecstasy. Because in the medieval mind, suffering for God meant joy. Even when it really, really shouldn't. The line between agony and ecstasy wasn't just thin, it curved in on itself like a Mobius strip. And then there's Saint Teresa of Avila. Yes, she's a bit later in history, but she's the crown jewel of this kind of mysticism. She described her visions of divine love in language so breathless, so sensuous, that art historians still get uncomfortable explaining her statue by Bernini. She writes, "He pierced me with a long spear of gold, and I felt a fire in my soul. The pain was so sweet I never wanted it to end." Aha! Now, Teresa was a mystic. A brilliant theologian. But her words became a blueprint for medieval understandings of holy desire. If you could channel your longing for flesh into longing for God, you'd basically hacked your libido into a fast pass to heaven. Historians still argue whether these ecstatic descriptions were spiritual metaphors or subconscious expressions of repressed sexuality. But the overlap is undeniable. Monks and nuns used the language of love, erotic love, to describe their union with Christ. Their writings overflowed with phrases like divine kiss, heavenly embrace, and consummation of the soul. One nun in the 13th century claimed she had spiritual intercourse with Christ nightly. She described his touch like flame and presence inside her heart. Was it symbolic? Maybe. Was it also her only outlet for feelings she wasn't allowed to name? Very possibly. Quirky fact, some mystical women would fall into trance-like states during prayer, collapsing, moaning, even convulsing. Observers often reported these moments with reverence and no small amount of awkward foot shuffling. After all, what do you do when Sister Beatrice starts writhing during morning psalms? And it wasn't just women. Male mystics like Bernard of Clairvaux described their longing for God in deeply emotional, almost romantic terms. Bernard even had a whole obsession with the Song of Songs, the biblical love poem usually attributed to Solomon. He saw every sensual image, kisses, perfume, golden thighs, as allegories for the soul's longing for Christ. A stretch? Maybe. But a widely accepted one. Even depictions of Jesus emphasized physical beauty. He was shown with soft features, flowing hair, a wound that artists lingered on with suggestive care. The lance piercing his side? Symbol of divine suffering, or something else, depending on how you read it. And then we have the Passion plays. These theatrical reenactments of Christ's crucifixion were intense, sometimes bloody, sometimes emotional, and sometimes deeply intimate. Female audience members were known to faint or cry uncontrollably. One abbess wrote that watching Christ suffer moved her womb as in childbirth. The connection between pain, compassion, and bodily response was powerful, and, again, blurry. The idea of the bride of Christ further fused romantic and religious imagery. Nuns were literally married to Jesus. They wore rings, had wedding ceremonies, and referred to him as their spouse. Some wrote love letters to Christ. Others said they felt his presence in bed at night. These weren't just flowery metaphors, they were lived, bodily experiences. And then there's martyrdom itself. To die for your faith was the ultimate act of devotion. And in the medieval imagination, it was also intensely eroticized. Saints were stripped, bound, pierced, burned, always with descriptions that lingered on skin, breath, tears. Not because medieval writers were perverts, well, maybe a few were, but because bodies mattered. Suffering in the body was how you proved your soul's worth. One chronicler described St. Lucy's death as a dance with flame, her body glowing, her eyes brighter than the fire. Another wrote of St. Sebastian, yes, that Sebastian, the one tied to a post and riddled with arrows, as a bridegroom pierced with divine desire. Yes. That statue you've seen of Sebastian looking like a shirtless Abercrombie model with arrows in his ribs? That wasn't a coincidence. But what does this all mean? It means that medieval people didn't see the body and the spirit as enemies. They saw them as entwined. Desire could be sacred. Pain could be purifying. And the most profound experiences, whether in bed or in prayer, were the ones that overwhelmed your senses. So next time you hear someone describe the Middle Ages as prudish, remember this: monks moaned in chapel, nuns wore rings for their heavenly husband, and saints died in poses that would make a Renaissance sculptor blush. And beneath all the incense and Latin, what you really hear is this longing. Not just for heaven, but for connection, for transcendence, for something that makes the heart race and the breath hitch and the soul open. Even if it means bleeding for it. The door creaks open, and you step into a small stone room, lit only by a flickering tallow candle. There's no printing press yet. No diagrams. No helpful charts with smiling cartoon eggs and sperm. And yet, someone is about to teach you the facts of life. Tonight, you're getting the medieval version of sex education, a mix of superstition, trial and error, dubious manuscripts, and the occasional whispered advice from someone's great-aunt who knew things. Welcome to the classroom of the 14th century. Your teachers? Wives, midwives, and a few bold men with ink-stained fingers and very questionable anatomical knowledge. Let's start with the professionals. Midwives weren't just baby catchers. They were walking encyclopedias of sex, fertility, contraception, and what not to do with nutmeg. They knew how to brew herbal teas that loosened the womb, how to tell if a woman was pregnant by the color of her urine, and, crucially, when to leave a couple alone with a few candles and a closed door. Their knowledge was passed down orally, mother to daughter, neighbor to neighbor. No diplomas, no charts. Just experience. And sometimes, a healthy helping of folklore. Did you know lying with your head facing north was said to produce male offspring? Or that drinking wine steeped in crushed worms could improve virility? You do now. Meanwhile, wives were the first-line sex educators for most medieval households. After marriage, the expectation was that a bride would receive instruction from older female relatives, or sometimes from the priest's housekeeper, if things got desperate. This education included which herbs to chew, parsley equals good, pennyroyal equals very bad but still popular. Which nights to avoid, Sundays, feast days, and, just to be safe, every Friday. And how to pray quickly when things got a little too enjoyable. Now, for the written resources. Enter the medieval sex manuals, often disguised as medical texts or theological treatises. These books, usually written by men, definitely not peer-reviewed, offered advice ranging from oddly specific to flat-out disturbing. One famous example, the De Secretis Mulierum, The Secrets of Women, attributed to Albertus Magnus. It includes bold claims like: a woman can conceive by dreaming of a man. The womb has a mouth that opens and closes at will. If a child is born with a birthmark, it's because the mother was thinking impure thoughts. Historians still argue whether these authors believed what they were writing or just needed something to fill the parchment. Either way, these manuals were wildly popular among the literate elite, who probably read them in the same way modern folks watch medical TikToks, with one eye on entertainment, the other on denial. One standout medieval belief? The two-seed theory. The idea was that both the man and woman produced seed, and a baby formed only when both were released at the same time. You know what that means. Female orgasm wasn't just allowed, it was necessary for conception. Cue 1,000 years of confusion and disappointment. Quirky fact, based on this theory, some women accused of adultery argued, well, I didn't finish, so I clearly couldn't be pregnant. And some men blamed their wives for not finishing, claiming it was their fault the baby had the neighbor's nose. Of course, this wasn't the only model of reproduction floating around. Some believed babies formed from menstrual blood refined by the man's seed. Others thought the moon determined gender. Still others claimed that sneezing immediately after sex could prevent pregnancy. There were actual instructions for post-coital sneezing techniques. And speaking of preventing pregnancy, let's talk contraception. The official church stance was no. Flat out, no exceptions, definitely a sin. But people, being people, got creative. Midwives and herbalists developed concoctions meant to close the womb or to thin the seed. Ingredients included rue, mint, savin, and occasionally, terrifyingly, mercury. One 13th century recipe called for washing in vinegar and then inserting a cloth soaked in wine and dried fig ash. Pleasant? No. Effective? Questionable. Barrier methods? There's evidence that linen or leather sheaths were used, mostly to prevent disease, but also as birth control. They were expensive, rare, and usually reserved for men who frequented brothels. Which tells you something about where public health priorities lay. Still, contraception was whispered about in back rooms and bathhouses, traded like secrets. Not because people didn't want children, children were essential to survival, but because too many could kill you. Pregnancy was risky. Childbirth was a gamble. And so, people, especially women, sought knowledge. Quietly. Desperately. Sometimes dangerously. That's where the midwife's book came in, a handwritten manual passed from woman to woman, often filled with herbal recipes, fertility charts, and diagrams that looked like confused potatoes but were, in fact, uteruses. And yes, there were position guides. Some texts, particularly those drawing from Arabic sources, included suggestions for enhancing pleasure or improving chances of conception. Raise the hips. Try the side. Avoid the hanging pose of the goat. Your guess is as good as mine. The trochelor, the medieval gold standard for women's medicine, recommended gentleness, scented oils, and communication between spouses. It's oddly progressive until it starts recommending urine as a diagnostic tool for literally everything, including stubborn husbands. Still, for all its weirdness, medieval sex education had a point: survival. Knowledge wasn't abstract. It was immediate. You learned because you had to. Because your cousin died in childbirth. Because your friend married at 14 and didn't know what was coming. Because you were told the devil lived between your legs, and you needed to find out whether that was metaphor or map. And if you were a man? Your education was equally patchy. Some boys were warned never to touch themselves, lest they go blind. Others were encouraged to clear the pipes regularly to avoid bad humors. Monks wrote about nocturnal emissions with the wide-eyed terror of someone describing a dragon. And yet, everyone figured it out, eventually. With help. Or panic. Or really bad advice involving onions. So now, as you sit by the hearth, sipping herbal tea of unclear origin, someone slides next to you and says, "Did you know nutmeg makes the heart burn hotter?" And you're not sure if that's medical fact, flirtation, or both. Because in the medieval world, sex education wasn't a class. It was a story. A warning. A recipe. A prayer. And if you were lucky, it came with footnotes scribbled in the margins that said, this part, maybe don't try this part. The room is dark, but you're awake. Again. The straw mattress scratches your skin, your hips ache, and your belly feels like a cauldron. A few feet away, your husband snores peacefully. You roll over, trying not to groan, because you're pregnant. Again. Tonight, we shift into the most constant companion of medieval intimacy, pregnancy, periods, and pregnancy again. Because for most women, sexuality wasn't about pleasure or scandal or even love. It was about fertility, and the endless, exhausting cycle that came with it. Let's start with the obvious: no one's using reliable contraception. Not in the peasant's barn. Not in the noblewoman's curtained bed. And not even in the brothel's back room. So when you had sex, you almost always ran the risk of pregnancy. Sometimes that was the goal. Often, it wasn't. And pregnancy? It wasn't glowing cheeks and baby bump photos. It was swollen ankles, terrifying uncertainty, and the very real possibility of dying in childbirth. On average, a medieval woman gave birth to 6 to 8 children. That sounds manageable until you remember, about half of them wouldn't survive past infancy, and neither might you. Every labor was a roll of the dice, and no one, not even queens, were spared the risks. Childbirth was entirely a woman's domain. Men were not allowed into the birthing chamber. Instead, women were attended by midwives, trusted neighbors, and older relatives. The room would be dark, warm, and filled with charms, saint medallions, relics, and holy candles. People prayed to Saint Margaret of Anjou, patron saint of childbirth, and hung her image on the walls to guide the baby safely through the dragon's mouth, a metaphor both vivid and, frankly, distressing. Labor could last hours or days. There were no epidurals. No antiseptics. If the baby was breech, or too large, the outcome was grim. Instruments like forceps weren't in widespread use, and caesarean sections were almost always fatal to the mother. And if you survived? You weren't out of danger. Childbed fever, a postpartum infection, was common, especially since washing hands between deliveries wasn't yet a thing. A fever could take you within days. And even if your body held up, your role was far from over. Because now you had to nurse. Wet nursing, handing the baby off to someone else to breastfeed, was common among the wealthy, but discouraged by the church, which feared it weakened the maternal bond. Among the poor, you nursed your child yourself. Often while pregnant with the next one. In fact, many women spent most of their adult lives either pregnant or recovering from pregnancy. Imagine the strain. The fear. The exhaustion. And still, life demanded you cook, clean, fetch water, work the fields, and try not to perish of malnutrition or plague. Now, let's talk about periods, a subject both taboo and strangely misunderstood by medieval medicine. A woman's monthly bleeding was seen as a natural purgation, a cleansing of excess humors. Theories of the body were based on balance, and menstruation was considered the female version of sweating, vomiting, or bleeding out leeches. Delightful. Still, periods were both feared and joked about. There were old wives' tales that a menstruating woman could sour milk, wilt crops, or make mirrors crack. One 15th century manuscript even claimed that if a dog ate menstrual blood, it would go mad and die. You know, casual Tuesday advice. But despite the fear, periods were also practical markers of fertility. A regular cycle meant a woman could bear children. An irregular one sparked anxiety, gossip, or worse, accusations of witchcraft. And if your period stopped, you were either pregnant, ill, or menopausal. In which case, your value to society plummeted. Hygiene products existed, sort of. Women might use rags, moss, or wool, held in place by belts or cords. Some went without anything, simply staying indoors or spreading straw on their seats. For poor women, menstruation wasn't a secret. It was just another part of survival. But let's not forget the men. Oh no. Medieval men had thoughts about menstruation. Medical texts warned husbands to abstain from sex during a woman's unclean days, claiming it could cause birth defects, illness, or spiritual contamination. Some clerics declared that children conceived during menstruation were born marked by sin or extra hairy. Historians still argue whether this was genuine belief or just a very elaborate excuse to avoid intimacy. And yet, the rules were contradictory. You weren't supposed to have sex during menstruation, but if you avoided your wife too long, you might drive her into temptation. So some advice manuals suggested mutual comfort with precautions, like perfuming the room, washing with vinegar, and saying a prayer before and after intercourse. You know. Romantic. Quirky fact. One medical guide recommended using a frog dried in the sun, placed beneath the woman's bed to ease period pain. Another suggested boiling crushed pearls in wine and drinking it while facing east. In both cases, the only real effect was probably distraction. But what happened when a woman didn't want to be pregnant? Contraception existed, but wasn't widely accessible or reliable. And abortion, though condemned by the church, was practiced quietly, usually in early stages, and with herbs like pennyroyal, rue, or tansy. These could be dangerous, even deadly. Still, for desperate women, it was a risk some were willing to take. And if the pregnancy continued? There were customs for predicting the baby's gender. Carrying low? It's a boy. Craving sweets? Definitely a girl. Dreaming of snakes? Better sleep sitting up. Some communities held birthing rituals, not baby showers, but gatherings of women offering advice, charms, and often strong drinks. The midwife might tie a girdle of holy text around the mother's belly or whisper prayers from the trochanter, the go-to medical text for women's health. And if the child survived the birth? He was usually baptized within days, partly out of devotion, partly out of fear that he might die unshriven. Infant mortality was high. Names were often reused, so it wasn't uncommon to find families with multiple children named John or Alice, each named for a sibling who didn't make it. So where does all this leave you, weary and wrapped in wool, staring up at the beams above your bed? It leaves you in awe. Because amid the chaos and ignorance and terror, medieval people, especially women, persisted. They bore life. They risked death. They held generations together with bare hands and aching backs. And they passed on what they knew, not in textbooks, but in lullabies, soup recipes, whispered advice between contractions. They weren't saints. They weren't martyrs. They were tired. And brave. And full of a kind of wisdom you can't get from parchment. You pull the blanket higher and place your hand on your belly. You might not know what's growing inside you, or what tomorrow holds, but you do know this: you are part of a story older than any book. And it keeps going. You're lying on your back, staring at a ceiling beam carved with flowers and strange little faces. One of them looks oddly smug, and suddenly the room goes quiet. Your partner has just whispered something that makes your ears burn and your eyebrows raise. You're not sure if you're scandalized or curious. Maybe both. Tonight, we're wandering off the beaten path, into the less talked about, often whispered world of medieval kinks and fetish fantasies. Yes, you read that right. Because for all its sermons and silences, the Middle Ages were not devoid of spice. Under the cloak of modesty, behind closed doors, or under hay bales, people had preferences. Some wanted pain. Some wanted feet. Some wanted things that would make a modern dating app blush. Let's start with flagellation, self-inflicted or otherwise. In religious circles, whipping was a form of penance, meant to imitate Christ's suffering. But as with many things in life, what started as spiritual sometimes wandered into the sensual. Some medieval mystics described ecstatic feelings during flogging, with language so breathless it might as well have come from a fan fiction forum. One nun even wrote that each strike brought my heart closer to heaven, and my body to fire. Was it piety? Passion? A little of both? Historians still argue whether flagellation was purely spiritual or sometimes performed with a knowing wink. Some communities held group flagellation rituals, participants stripped to the waist, chanting as they whipped themselves and each other. Supposedly for salvation. But maybe, just maybe, some were enjoying the experience a little too much. Then there's the foot thing. Yes, foot fetishes go way, way back. In medieval literature, feet were often described in loving detail, especially women's feet. Pale, smooth, as white as alabaster, and small enough to fit into dainty, jewel-studded slippers. Some lovers wrote poems to a lady's toes. One knight declared he would rather kiss the arch of his beloved's foot than drink wine again. Bold words in a time when wine was safer than water. In some illuminated manuscripts, figures are drawn licking or caressing feet in scenes that, while not overtly erotic, definitely raise a few eyebrows. Maybe it was symbolic humility. Maybe it was artistic liberty. Or maybe Brother Gerald had a thing for ankles and a very long winter to pass. Quirky fact? In one 14th century French romance, a character asks to sleep at his lady's feet, not her side. Not because he's being chivalrous. Because he's obsessed with her shoes. The text lovingly describes him polishing her boots while she dozes off. If that isn't kink, I don't know what is. Then there are the furs. Oh yes, fur fetishes were a thing. Especially in Northern Europe, where animal pelts were common and, conveniently, luxurious. Fox fur, ermine, sable, they weren't just for warmth. They were also status symbols and sensory delights. Some people wore them under their clothes, directly on the skin, for the pleasurable feel. Others lined their beds with them for added texture. In a few court records, furs are mentioned as gifts in seduction cases, like lingerie, but louder and significantly more expensive. One nobleman was accused of trying to bribe a married woman into bed with an ermine muff. Her husband wasn't mad about the affair, he was mad he couldn't afford matching gloves. And now, let's talk about roleplay. While there weren't any medieval cosplay conventions, unless you count jousting, people did perform identity in ways that hinted at fantasy. Dressing as someone else, knights, nobles, even saints, had theatrical and often erotic undertones. Troubadour songs regularly described women who disguised themselves as knights to seduce other women. One poem ends with the line, "She rode in armor, her sword at her hip, and her mouth on mine." Subtle? Not really. Beautiful? Absolutely. Theaters and morality plays also flirted with taboos. A particularly cheeky tradition in Germany involved dressing actors in devil costumes, complete with tails that were anatomically suggestive. Audiences laughed, but the underlying fascination was clear. Sin could be funny, but it was also thrilling. Even more direct? Animal play. Yes, there are images, marginalia again, of humans dressed as animals, or animals acting like humans. Some of these were social commentary. Others? Well, let's just say the line between satire and fantasy is a blurry one when a rabbit is spanking a man in bishop robes while riding a dog. These drawings weren't necessarily kinky in the modern sense, but they reflect a playful, layered view of the body and identity. Masks, reversals, transformation, classic elements of fantasy. And while it may seem strange to modern ears, some people in the Middle Ages leaned into eroticized asceticism, finding arousal in denial. A man might refuse pleasure for months, then write about his dreams with such vivid detail, you'd swear he was trying to invent the romance novel. Women pledged to chastity often described their spiritual marriage to Christ in terms so sensual they read like bodice rippers with Latin footnotes. So what does all this tell us? It tells us medieval people had desire with personality. Their preferences, like ours, were shaped by culture, scarcity, and imagination. They didn't have categories like we do now, no lists of fetishes, no acronyms, but they knew what stirred them. A certain touch. A particular fabric. The tension of pain and devotion. The ritual of washing someone's feet. And unlike modern society, which sometimes splits pleasure into neat boxes, medieval folks were often more integrated in their thinking. Sex could be funny, prayerful, weird, messy, holy, shameful, and beautiful, all at once. So as you lie in bed, thinking about your partner's whispered request, whether it involves boots, feathers, or reciting psalms backwards, you smile. Because desire has always had layers. Kinks have always existed. And history? Well, it's always been more fun than textbooks let on. You're leaning against a stone wall in the courtyard, chewing a crust of bread, when you see them, your neighbor's husband and the baker's daughter, walking just a little too close, laughing just a little too softly. You raise an eyebrow. You're not surprised. Because in the Middle Ages, adultery wasn't rare. It was risky, raw, and full of excuses that would make even the boldest bard blush. Tonight, we're slinking through the tangled web of infidelity, punishments, and medieval damage control, where marriages were strategic, passion was dangerous, and getting caught could cost you your teeth or your property. Let's start with the obvious: adultery was officially a sin. The church declared it loud and clear. If you were married and got frisky with someone else, you were committing mortal sin. No question. Straight to confession. Do not pass go, do not collect your chalice of wine. But in practice, things got a little complicated. Men were rarely punished as harshly as women. A nobleman with a wandering eye might be scolded by his confessor and told to fast for a week. A noblewoman who strayed? She could lose her children, her lands, or even her freedom. And if you were a peasant? Your punishment might depend on whether the local lord had slept with your cousin. Still, people cheated. Often. And not just because they were bored. Sometimes it was political, a way to form secret alliances, trade influence, or secure financial support. Sometimes it was emotional, a response to arranged marriages with no warmth. And sometimes it was just carnal, a roll in the hay with someone who didn't snore or smell like pickled onions. Let's talk about the excuses. One man claimed he didn't know the woman was married because she did not wear her wifely veil. Another claimed the devil possessed his loins. A woman in England insisted she was asleep the whole time. Deeply asleep, she clarified. Her husband didn't buy it. Neither did the court. Quirky fact? In some regions, you could be charged with adultery even if no sex actually occurred, just suspicion was enough. One French town had a rule that if two people were caught lying on the same cloak after sunset, they could be fined. Unless they were siblings. Or pretending to be siblings. Honestly, it was all very flexible. Now, let's say you're caught in the act. What happens next depends on your social status and your spouse's patience. For peasants, the village court might order public penance. Picture this: you, barefoot, wearing nothing but your shift, holding a sign that reads "I betrayed my marriage bed" while standing on a barrel in the town square. If you were wealthier, the consequences got more creative and legal. In some places, husbands could sue their wife's lover for alienation of affection. Yes, medieval people had a concept of stealing someone's emotional loyalty. Very ahead of their time. For noble women, the stakes were highest. Adultery could be treason, especially if you bore an illegitimate child who might inherit lands. Queens who cheated often faced execution, exile, or imprisonment. Think of Anne Boleyn, later on, beheaded largely on charges of adultery, likely fabricated, and you get the picture. But husbands weren't invincible. One case in 14th century Germany involved a woman who caught her husband in bed with the maid. She dragged them both into the street, naked, and beat him with a wooden spoon while shouting, "Let all know the dog I married." The village court fined her 5 eggs for public disruption. Worth it. And of course, the church tried to contain the chaos. They issued rules for penance. Days of fasting, barefoot pilgrimages, paying for new altar candles. Confessors were advised to be firm but gentle, which usually meant a long lecture about burning in hell while scribbling down how many acts of sin occurred and on which days. Still, confession was a loophole. You could cheat, confess, and be forgiven over and over again. Provided you weren't too brazen about it. Or didn't get your lover pregnant. Or murdered your spouse. Then things got dicey. Some people didn't confess at all. They just ran. Elopement was a messy, romantic, often stupid solution. A woman might run off with her lover, faking widowhood. A man might leave his village and remarry elsewhere under a new name. The church, when it caught wind of such cases, would sometimes dispatch envoys to retrieve the wayward soul, or send letters begging them to repent before death, lest they be damned with hot pitch. Of course, jealousy could turn fatal. Records abound of husbands killing their wives, or vice versa, over suspected affairs. In some places, these were treated as crimes of passion and received lighter sentences. One husband in Florence was acquitted after killing his wife's lover with a chamber pot. The judge declared, he acted as a man, not a criminal. Justice was subjective. But not all stories ended in blood or shame. Some marriages survived infidelity. People reconciled, forgave, moved on. One woman, after learning her husband had fathered 3 children with the baker's wife, simply shrugged and said, "Well, they've his nose. Let's feed them." Practical. Brutal. Very medieval. And some affairs were celebrated if you were powerful enough. Kings had mistresses. Lords kept lovers. Courts revolved around flirtation, poetry, and very public private affairs. Eleanor of Aquitaine and Henry II? Not exactly the poster children for marital fidelity. But they stayed married. For the empire. Even clergy weren't immune. Priests were expected to be celibate, but many had housekeepers who miraculously bore their nephews. One bishop was so prolific he had to build a separate wing in his estate for his nieces. Everyone knew. Nobody said a word. So where does that leave you, watching your neighbor's scandal unfold? It leaves you in a world where love, loyalty, and desire were as messy as the roads after rain. A world where people slipped, lied, begged forgiveness, and sometimes meant it. A world where passion wasn't always pretty, but it was always human. And maybe, just maybe, that's what made it worth the risk. You're at a wedding feast now. The pig is roasted, the ale is flowing, and someone is drunkenly playing a harp. The bride and groom sit awkwardly at the center of it all, cheeks flushed, hands twitching, not from love but from nerves. Because tonight, everyone will know if they are consummated properly. Welcome to the bewildering world of wedding nights, bedding rituals, and proving it happened, where privacy was optional and pressure was absolutely part of the package. Let's rewind. In the medieval mind, a wedding wasn't truly official until the couple had sex. You could say vows, wear garlands, share bread, but until you got under the covers and did the deed, you weren't spiritually, legally, or socially married. That's where the phrase, consummate the marriage, comes from, to complete it. And, believe it or not, people took this very seriously. Let's start with the most eyebrow-raising tradition, the bedding ceremony. In many communities, especially among nobles, the newlyweds were literally escorted to bed by family, friends, clergy, and sometimes the entire town. The goal? To ensure they were both alive, sober, and in the same room together. Depending on the region, this ranged from awkward to absolutely unhinged. In some French courts, the groom would undress in front of everyone, down to his linen shirt, and the bride would be helped into her night smock by her maids. In parts of Germany, guests would sing bawdy songs, pelt the couple with nuts, yes, really, or toss coins on the bed for fertility. In England, guests might linger in the room, pretending to adjust the sheets or tuck in the blankets, while very much not leaving. And then they waited. Not for the full act, thank heavens, but for confirmation. That could come in the form of a spot of blood on the sheets, not always reliable, by the way. A sheepish grin from the groom. Or, in some cases, a public statement from the priest that the marriage was made whole. It was equal parts performance, tradition, and social surveillance. A sort of collective nudge that said, we saw you go in, and we expect results. Quirky fact? In one Scottish custom, the bride's stocking was thrown into the fire during the bedding ceremony. If it curled toward the groom, it meant passion. If it curled away? Cold feet. Literally. Now, you may ask, why all the fuss? Because inheritance, legitimacy, and alliances depended on a valid marriage. If the couple didn't consummate, the union could be annulled. That meant property returned, alliances shattered, and everyone very annoyed. So bedding wasn't about romance, it was politics under a blanket. That pressure could be crushing. Imagine being 14, newly married, and surrounded by giggling relatives who expect you to perform like a champion athlete. One chronicler described a groom who fainted from anxiety. The next day, he tried again. Fainted again. After the third try, the priest gently suggested more time and maybe fewer spectators. On the flip side, consummation could be wielded as a weapon. If a woman was forced into marriage but managed to avoid sex with her new husband, she could later argue the union was invalid. That small sliver of bodily autonomy, whether she allowed it to happen or not, could mean the difference between freedom and permanent servitude. One famous case in 13th century England involved a noblewoman who refused her much older husband's advances for 3 years. When he tried to force the issue, she locked herself in a tower and eventually had the marriage annulled for non-consummation. Legend says she later married a younger man and glowed. But let's say the couple did go through with it. What was it like? Medieval sex manuals weren't exactly tender. They focused more on positioning for fertility, avoiding sin, and ensuring the act didn't happen on holy days, of which there were a lot. But there were exceptions. Some texts advised couples to light candles so they could see each other's faces. Use oils for warmth and ease. Say a prayer before and after, thanking God for the union. The Trotula, that ever-helpful medical guide, even included recipes for calming nerves and increasing affection, like soaking rose petals in goat's milk. Sweet, if a bit impractical. And yes, the pressure to bleed on the wedding night was very real. The belief that virginity equaled vaginal bleeding was widespread. Never mind that this isn't true for everyone. If the bride didn't produce a stain sheet, whispers started. She might be accused of premarital activity, witchcraft, or even infidelity. Some women reportedly faked it using pricked fingers, animal blood, or, ingeniously, red berries mashed into the linen. Historians still argue whether this expectation was more about symbolic proof or misogynistic control. Probably both. In rare cases, families displayed the wedding sheet publicly the morning after, like a medieval version of posting a relationship update. We did it! Here's the proof. You can practically hear the church bells ringing in smug triumph. And yet, not every wedding night was a trial. Some couples genuinely liked each other. Some were friends before they were spouses. Others grew into affection over time. The first night may have been awkward, but not unkind. A slow conversation, a tentative kiss, shared warmth beneath woolen covers. A beginning, not a spectacle. Even love, real love, existed in these arranged matches. And while the bedding ceremony faded over the centuries, the memories lingered. Grandmothers told stories. Husbands teased wives about how red you turned. Families quietly burned the sheets with no questions asked. So now, as you sit by the fire, imagining your own turn beneath the linen canopy, you wonder, what will people say about you in the morning? Maybe nothing. Maybe everything. But one thing is certain, your wedding night, in the Middle Ages, wasn't private. It was part ritual, part rite, part public audit of your private self. And somehow, in the flickering candlelight, amid the laughter and the nerves, it still managed to matter. The bells toll midnight, and the streets are quieter now, except for the rustle of silk skirts slipping down alleyways and the low murmur of secrets exchanged behind wooden shutters. Tonight, we follow those whispers straight into the beating heart of medieval desire's underworld, affairs, brothels, and the women who ruled them. You're standing at the edge of the red light district. Yes, they existed, even then. In London, it's Southwark. In Paris, it's the Rue Gravois. In Florence, well, you could practically pick a street. Candles flicker behind colored panes. A curtain lifts. A woman smiles. This is not the church-approved version of love. This is pleasure for hire. And it's far more structured, accepted, and regulated than you might think. Let's start with the truth. Medieval cities often licensed brothels. They were taxed, monitored, and even zoned, just like marketplaces or blacksmith shops. Why? because local authorities figured it was better to control sex work than let it flourish in chaos. It was the lesser evil. A way to protect unmarried men from more serious sins. Yes, that's how they framed it. So what were these places like? Imagine a crooked, two-story wooden building with creaky floorboards and curtains instead of doors. The madam, usually a former worker herself, ran the house like a business. She paid the taxes, kept the peace, and made sure the girls didn't attract too much attention from the wrong people. The workers? They were complicated. Some were forced into the trade, orphans, debtors, or abandoned wives. Others entered by choice, especially if it meant better food, clothes, and, believe it or not, more freedom than domestic service. In the brothel, you earned your own coin. In a nobleman's kitchen, you belonged to someone else. Some women even gained power. They became wealthy, connected. A few climbed socially, married clients, or bought property. One Parisian madam owned 3 houses, 5 dresses with silver trim, and a bed stuffed with goose down. Not bad, considering most women in her quarter slept on straw and washed with rainwater. Quirky fact? In many towns, prostitutes were required to wear specific clothing like striped hoods, yellow veils, or bells sewn into their dresses. The idea was to mark them, but the effect? They became fashion trendsetters. Stripes, after all, are bold. And yes, there were rules. Brothels were only open certain hours. Some closed on Sundays and holy days, though enforcement was spotty. Sex workers were supposed to undergo regular health checks, not for their benefit, but to prevent disease from spreading to paying clients. Penalties existed for abuse, forced entry, or underage girls, but justice was rare, especially for the vulnerable. And then came the contradictions. Because while townsfolk used brothels, they also judged them. Respectable women didn't walk near them. Priests condemned them in sermons. And if a city wanted to clean up its image? Brothels were first to be relocated. Usually to worse neighborhoods, farther from help. Still, they endured, because desire doesn't care about zoning laws. Of course, not all sex work happened in official brothels. There were independent women who took lovers for coin in private homes or out in the open. Some worked alone, others in pairs. There were even walking girls who patrolled the town square, striking deals beneath the statues of saints. Then came the courtesans, a breed apart. They weren't just sex workers. They were companions, artists, poets, and provocateurs. In Italy especially, courtesans were educated, cultured, and dressed to shame queens. They dined with dukes, advised kings, and sometimes wrote memoirs. The most famous among them? Veronica Franco of Venice, writer, thinker, and seductress extraordinaire. Courtesans blurred the line between lover and diplomat. They were trained in conversation, skilled in music, fluent in multiple languages. If you were rich and needed both pleasure and prestige, you hired one. Sometimes for the evening. Sometimes for years. And what about men? Yes, male sex workers existed too, though far less documented. They catered to women, rare, and to other men, rarer still in the records, though certainly more common in practice. Some were entertainers or acrobats, others, servants who moonlighted. The risk for men caught selling sex, especially to other men, was high. The church's condemnation of sodomy was loud, and penalties could be fatal. Which brings us to the hypocrisy. Because medieval society needed these women and men, but refused to respect them. A bishop might preach against fornication in the morning, then visit the brothel that evening. A town council might pass anti-vice laws, then hold its meetings in a building owned by a madam. It was survival, morality, and economics, all in one messy bundle. But for all that, these workers built community. They formed networks. Looked after each other. Shared warnings about dangerous clients. Cared for one another's children. A madam might feed a girl for weeks even if she wasn't earning. A veteran might teach a newcomer how to dress, how to read a man's mood, how to laugh at jokes that weren't funny without crying. Some even had codes, secret signs carved into the wood of the bedframe or the door jamb. A heart meant safety. A slash meant beware. A flower drawn in chalk meant, someone here remembers your name. And yes, love happened. Sometimes a worker fell for a client, or the other way around. Sometimes those stories ended badly. Sometimes they didn't. There are records of marriages between former sex workers and wealthy merchants, even knights. Some towns allowed such unions, others refused to baptize their children. One widow, once a courtesan, donated her savings to rebuild the parish roof. The priest refused the gift. The townspeople used it anyway. Rain doesn't care who paid for the tiles. So tonight, as you drift through the city's shadows, listening to the echo of laughter and footsteps, you wonder who tells the truth about desire. The church? The courts? The madams? Maybe it's the woman behind the curtain, lighting a candle, brushing her hair, and preparing, again, to meet a stranger who sees only what he wants. Or maybe it's you. Because to understand desire, you have to leave the chapel. Walk the streets. Listen closely. And remember, love, lust, and survival have always shared a pillow. The sun is low now, casting long shadows across the village green. Smoke rises from cottage chimneys, and you pass by a group of women plucking geese, chatting in low, knowing voices. One of them looks up, eyes sparkling, and says, "You wouldn't believe what I heard," and just like that, we've entered the realm of gossip, suspicion, and the ever-looming fear of being too different. Tonight, we peer into accusations of sex magic and witchcraft. Because in a world where people couldn't explain the wind changing direction or a cow going dry, guess who often got blamed? That's right, her. The older woman with the herb pouch. The midwife who knew too much. The widow who didn't remarry. The girl who said no too often, or not often enough. In the medieval mindset, sex and sorcery were entangled in deep, messy ways. Start with the church's obsession with purity. A woman's body, they said, was a vessel for life, or temptation. If she knew how to ease menstrual cramps or brew an herbal drink to bring on a late period, she wasn't wise. She was suspicious. Because healing looked a lot like control, and control wasn't something a good woman was meant to have. So if a man's desires got the better of him, maybe he was bewitched. Maybe she slipped something in his wine. Maybe she looked at him too long and now he can't sleep. Historians still argue whether these accusations stemmed more from fear of female sexuality or fear of female knowledge, but likely both. And thus, accusations of sex magic were born. People believed witches could impotent a man with a curse or a knot tied during sex, cause a woman to miscarry with a glare, steal male virility by collecting semen and burying it in the fields. Yes, that was a real belief. And yes, it caused some awkward shoveling. Quirky fact? There was a widespread fear of witches stealing male genitals, not metaphorically, but literally. The Malleus Maleficarum, a 15th century witch hunting manual, claimed some witches kept severed penises in nests like eggs. One account said a man found his stolen member inside a box being fed oats like a pet snake. Try explaining that at confession. Even midwives weren't safe. Though they were essential to every village, their deep knowledge of reproduction, pain relief, and miscarriage made them prime targets during witchcraft panics. After all, they saw women at their most vulnerable. They knew where babies came from and how to prevent them. That knowledge looked an awful lot like power. One midwife in 14th century Germany was accused of enchanting women to become barren, using nothing but a touch and a few whispered words. Another in Scotland was said to fly on her broom to meet the devil on sex feast nights. Whatever that meant, it sounds oddly like a themed rave. And the rituals? Often misinterpreted. A woman making a protective charm with herbs and wax might be seen as casting a love spell. A fertility blessing could be twisted into a demonic rite. Even prayer beads, if used at the wrong moment, or with the wrong verse, were suspect. If a woman was too seductive? Witch. Too chaste? Witch. Married and childless? Witch? Too beautiful? A temptress? Too plain? Clearly hiding something. It wasn't just women, of course. Men were accused too, especially if they were known to seduce married women or practice folk healing. But the vast majority of sex-related accusations fell on women, often those without protection, widows, healers, midwives, unmarried mothers. Some of the accusations were heartbreakingly ridiculous. One woman was accused of using a love apple to seduce her neighbor's son. Another of drawing men into her hut by dancing with no shoes. A third was tried for causing a storm that delayed a wedding after a jealous rival claimed she looked at the sky too hard. And what happened if you were found guilty? It depended on the place and period. Early medieval courts might hand down a fine or public shaming. Later, during the height of witchcraft hysteria, punishments escalated: torture, imprisonment, even execution. Inquisitors were especially interested in sexual behavior. They asked about devil lovers, claimed witches had carnal congress with demons, and made people confess to acts they didn't even understand. One poor woman, after days without sleep, finally said yes, she had lain with a black dog during a thunderstorm. She was burned the next day. The worst part? Most accusations weren't about actual magic. They were about control. A wife who challenged her husband. A woman who knew how to deliver babies. A girl who didn't play by the rules. Which was the medieval word for too much. And yet, people whispered about spells. They passed down love charms, tucked herbs under pillows, and carried amulets just in case. The line between superstition and crime was thin. One priest might condemn charms, another might recommend them, quietly, with a wink. Sex magic, for most, wasn't about dark pacts or actual enchantments. It was about longing. About hope. About trying to control something uncontrollable: desire, fertility, loss, attraction. People reached for rituals when they couldn't explain why they loved who they loved, or why the one they wanted didn't want them back. And in that desperation, some accused. Some whispered. Some suffered. But some thrived. Some wise women walked the tightrope perfectly. They sold blessing teas, love tokens, and fertility symbols while never drawing too much attention. They smiled sweetly at bishops. Attended mass, knew which herbs were safe to discuss and which ones were just for the girls. So as the night deepens and the fire crackles low, you think about the stories lost to silence, the women who mixed, healed, whispered, and touched hearts and bodies with quiet skill. They weren't witches. Or maybe they were. Either way, they knew things. And in a world that punished knowing, that made them dangerous. The stars are out now, brilliant, scattered, and just a bit unsettling. You walk past a crumbling chapel, its stained glass catching moonlight like spilled wine. A young couple slips around the corner, giggling. But not far behind, a figure watches from the shadows, hooded, still, and silent. No, it's not a ghost. It's the church, ever present and ever watching, especially when it comes to your body. Tonight, we ease into the velvet ropes of confession booths, church control, and forbidden thoughts, because while medieval people had bodies full of desire, they also had souls under surveillance. Let's start with the setup. Sex, in the eyes of the medieval church, was a necessary evil. It was allowed, yes, even encouraged, within marriage, on certain days, for the sole purpose of procreation. Enjoying it too much? That was edging dangerously close to sin. Doing it for fun? Sin. Doing it on a Sunday? Sin. Advent? Lent? During daylight? After eating too much? Still sin. So who made the rules? Primarily, priests, monks, bishops, men who, in theory, were celibate and holy. But let's just say there were exceptions. Clerics sometimes kept housekeepers who mysteriously gave birth every other year. Monks wrote confession manuals detailing sex acts in such elaborate language that you begin to suspect they were working through a few things. Still, the rules were real. There were entire church documents, called penitentials, dedicated to cataloging sexual behavior and assigning appropriate penance. These books were like early medieval tax forms, but instead of declaring your income, you declared how and when you, misbehaved. Examples? Oh, absolutely. Masturbation, 3 years of penance, unless you were a teenager, then just 1 year, how generous. Oral sex, 7 years of penance. Sex while standing, considered animalistic, for years. Sex in the wrong position, which usually meant anything but missionary, varied wildly, but often included fasting, alms, and extra prayer. Thinking about sex too often? Confess immediately and avoid cheese for a week. Okay, that last one's questionable, but wouldn't surprise you, right? Historians still argue whether these penalties were actually enforced or mostly symbolic control tools, a kind of guilt scaffolding to keep people fearful but manageable. The most intimate aspect of church control? Confession. Introduced as a personal, regular sacrament by the 13th century, confession became a weekly or monthly event for many believers. You'd kneel, probably shaking, and list your transgressions. And since sex was the most personal and the most confusing, people often spent a lot of time talking about it. Even when they didn't want to. And the confessor? He'd heard it all. One priest, writing anonymously in the 14th century, admitted that half his confessional hours were spent explaining why married couples could not, in fact, try the French method. His words, not mine. Another noted with weary penmanship that young men often sin with animals or dreams. These are to be handled delicately. Then there was thought crime. Lustful dreams? Sin. Looking too long at someone's bare ankle? Temptation. Entertaining the idea that sex might be pleasurable for women, too. Tread carefully. People confessed for thoughts they had while churning butter, while washing linens, while walking past a shrine. But here's the contradiction: everyone was thinking about it. Sex was everywhere, implied in songs, hidden in folk tales, etched into manuscript margins, muttered behind walls. Yet everyone pretended it wasn't. Or at least, pretended they weren't enjoying it. The church wasn't just trying to regulate behavior, it was trying to claim authority over your interior life. Quirky fact? One 12th century bishop instructed priests to ask married couples, do you engage in the act with joy, or merely with duty? Because the first might require penance. Yes, joy was suspicious. And the result? A society full of people feeling guilt for being human. Desire became something to fear, to push down, to confess over and over like a chronic illness. And yet, in that fear, a strange kind of community formed. Everyone sinned. Everyone stumbled. Everyone lined up outside the church steps with the same nervous face. Of course, some rebelled. Mystics like Marjorie Kemp claimed visions of Christ that included overwhelming feelings of physical ecstasy. She wrote about being ravished in her soul, which got side eyes from church officials but wild admiration from common folk. Her spirituality was sensual, wrapped in metaphors of union, longing, and yes, what sounded suspiciously like climax. Others rebelled quietly. They married for love. They laughed during sex. They carved little jokes into the rafters of their homes. They whispered secrets in each other's ears that no priest would ever hear. They prayed with their hands folded and their feet entwined beneath the blanket. And the church, despite all its rules, knew people would stray. That's why confession existed. It wasn't just penance, it was a system of forgiveness on tap. You sin, you confess, you're forgiven. Cycle repeat. It was almost comforting, in a way. Like spiritual dry cleaning. So now, as you sit in the dark with your thoughts, wondering whether it's okay to remember someone's lips or hands or smile, you know what a medieval priest would say. Confess it. But maybe, just maybe, you smile instead. Because desire is part of being alive. And even in the most devout village, under the sternest bishop, hearts still beat faster when fingers brush by accident, or voices soften in candlelight. Confession was never really about silencing you. It was about reminding you someone was always listening. But tonight? No one's listening but the stars. You're dreaming now, half asleep, drifting through flickering scenes stitched together with candlelight and memory. A velvet ribbon tied around the wrist. A whispered promise behind a curtain. A wooden comb left on the pillow. Welcome to the loves, losses, and longing that shaped medieval souls. Because when the rules cracked and the rituals faded, what remained was what we're here for tonight: romantic yearning, private poetry, and the ghost stories of love. Forget duty. Forget dowries. Tonight, we aren't looking at marriages of politics or pressure. We're following the scent of the ones who fell too hard, who scribbled their longing on scraps of parchment or sighed beneath the moon while everyone else slept. Love, in the Middle Ages, wasn't always safe. But it was always real. Let's start with courtly love, that confusing, heady mix of flirtation, honor, and impossibility. Picture this: a knight devotes himself to a lady, usually married, usually distant. He writes her poems, fights in her name, fasts for her virtue, and suffers gloriously because she cannot be his. Romantic? Certainly. Delusional? Often. Courtly love was less about sex and more about exalted agony. The goal wasn't consummation, it was the burn. The ache. The idea that to love someone unattainable was to make yourself nobler. You suffered beautifully. You held her glove like it was a holy relic. And sometimes, she noticed. Sometimes she didn't. One French knight wrote, "Her smile is my chapel, her shadow my wine." His friends probably rolled their eyes, but his words survive. Quirky fact? Some manuals advised noble lovers to keep their affair spiritual by never speaking directly. Instead, they could express devotion by coughing at key moments or dropping flowers in front of the lady's horse. Think of it as a slow-burn romance with no texting. But love wasn't always so lofty. In village corners and dark taverns, people fell hard and fast. They loved the miller's apprentice or the blacksmith's son. They passed love notes folded into laundry baskets, or sang songs beneath windows. Love found its way through shutter cracks and behind haystacks. One 14th century girl carved a heart into the side of a barn with the initials B+M. Centuries later, it's still there. Weather-worn. Faint. But real. And sometimes love was painful. Because people didn't always choose wisely. Or freely. One English peasant woman named Cecily was caught running away with a man she'd loved since childhood. Her family dragged her home. The man was flogged. She married someone else. 10 years later, court records show she petitioned for an annulment on grounds that her heart belonged elsewhere. Whether she succeeded is unknown. What we do know is that the ache of the unsaid and the unlived sat heavy in the medieval chest. Love unreturned wasn't just romantic, it was cosmic. A disorder of the humors. A sickness of the soul. There were even medical treatments for heartbreak. One doctor advised patients to look at beautiful objects to distract the mind. Another suggested cold baths and a diet of barley. A third, more poetic soul, recommended walking alone at sunrise while whispering the name of the beloved until the grief faded. Historians still argue whether that last one worked, but it's oddly soothing to imagine. And then there were love charms. Bundles of hair knotted with ribbon. Rings dipped in wine and buried under a lover's doorstep. Verses copied and carried close to the skin. Some whispered the name of a saint. Others wrote the beloved's name backward and burned it by moonlight. Were they spells? Or prayers? Maybe both. Because when your heart aches in a world without therapy, playlists, or rom-coms, you find comfort where you can. In superstition. In song. In the deep sigh you release into the night air, hoping someone hears. Love also lived in letters. Illiterate lovers hired scribes to write for them, carefully dictated, sometimes code-laced, always full of longing. To the one who brings warmth to my sleep even when absent, begins one letter from a soldier to his wife. She likely had it read to her by a priest, blushing as she listened. And of course, there were ghosts. Because where there is love, there is loss. And where there is loss, there are stories. Medieval folk tales are full of lovers returned from the grave. A woman who combed her hair every night by the window, waiting for a fiancé lost at sea, until he knocked one night and kissed her, pale as moonlight, before disappearing forever. A man who married another, only to see his first love's face in the fireplace every year on their anniversary. These stories weren't meant to frighten. They were meant to say, love lasts. Even when it shouldn't. Even when it can't. And sometimes love broke every rule and survived anyway. Like the nun who ran away from her convent with a troubadour, and lived the rest of her life selling apples in the market under a new name. Or the scribe who confessed his secret love for a monk in the margins of a prayer book, where no one would look until someone did, 600 years later. History is full of official records. But the unofficial ones? The etched initials, the pressed flowers, the unmailed letters, those are the real treasures. So now, as you lie there with your own memories humming behind your eyes, you think of them, the lovers who risked everything. The ones who waited. The ones who whispered. The ones who left fingerprints on parchment and tears on pillowcases. Love in the Middle Ages wasn't easy. But it was everywhere. In firelit glances. In stubborn hope. In the way someone said your name like it meant something. And it still is. The air is thick now with lavender and wood smoke, and your eyelids feel heavy. You're curled beneath a woolen blanket, listening to the hush of a world that has, for the most part, fallen asleep. But before we fade into dreams, there's one last door to open, one final candle to follow down the corridor of time. Tonight, we press gently into the last pages of this journey, to explore the intimate fears, the quiet questions, and the slow fade of medieval beliefs about sex as the world inched toward the Renaissance. Because for all the incense and inquisition, the silks and the shame, medieval people were still people, uncertain, curious, and tender in ways that often don't make it into history books. Let's start with what they feared most, dying in sin. To die unconfessed, with a heart full of lust and a soul unclean, was terrifying. Not just because of hell, but because of what came before it. Purgatory was a swirling grey space filled with pain, waiting, and longing. A sort of spiritual laundromat where souls were scrubbed of stains before they could ascend. And sexual sin? That left some of the deepest stains. A knight might pray before battle, not just for protection from arrows, but for forgiveness for the girl he kissed under the oak tree the night before. A nun might flagellate herself at dawn, begging for purity of thought after a vivid dream. A merchant might donate a whole side chapel just to earn back divine favor after years of questionable company. But here's the thing, they didn't stop desiring. Even as the church thundered from pulpits and kings ordered moral crackdowns, the heart went on humming its reckless little tune. People wanted, badly, to be held, to be chosen, to be known. And that's what makes this history so achingly familiar. Yes, they wore linen. Yes, they used dried rosemary as deodorant. Yes, they bathed less often than we do, though not never, by the way, don't let Renaissance snobbery fool you. But emotionally? Spiritually? They were just like you. They struggled with guilt. They cherished stolen moments. They wondered if their feelings were holy or wicked, or maybe both. They asked questions like, why do I want someone I can't have? Can love exist without marriage? Is it a sin if it feels like truth? Historians still argue whether the shift toward Renaissance humanism marked a relaxation of these tensions or just a reshuffling. Certainly, art became more sensual. Bodies were celebrated more openly. Even church figures, hello, Borgia family, seemed a little more comfortable indulging their passions. But for centuries, the medieval mindset lingered. Even today, you can feel echoes of it. In wedding rituals we don't fully understand. In words like maiden, virtue, soulmate. In the shame that sometimes creeps in after desire. In the longing for something pure and lasting, even if the world tells you it doesn't exist. And what about the love that never found its place? There were so many. The lovers separated by war or vow. The people whose desire didn't fit their society's shape. The ones who felt everything too deeply, too brightly. Their stories often don't survive, not in official records, at least. But sometimes you find a trace. A name scratched into wood. A pair of rosary beads left on a windowsill. A half-finished song. Those ghosts are real. They brush your cheek on cold nights. They live in the space between lines of ink. They're the reason some of us cry during love stories and feel wistful in empty rooms. Because some part of us remembers. Not a specific life, but a pattern. A rhythm. A soft ache older than our names. And so we close this scroll, not with judgment, but with understanding. Desire in the Middle Ages was tangled and fraught, yes, but also funny, strange, earnest, and full of yearning. It smelled like candle wax and lavender and sweat and wet earth. It sounded like choir song, laughter, muffled whispers, and the hush of someone saying your name just once more before sleep. If there's one thing you take from this journey, let it be this. They weren't so different. The girl brushing her hair in the candlelight. The boy hiding love letters in his boot. The nun whispering secrets into her pillow. The knight dreaming of the one he left behind. They were all just trying to make sense of love. Like you. And now. The fire is low. The night is still. And your pillow is warm. Take a deep breath. Let it out slowly. You're safe here. You've wandered far through whispered halls and moonlit corners. You've laughed, maybe blushed, maybe imagined your own footprints on those cobbled streets. And now, it's time to let go of all that. Time to drift. Softly. Silently. Sweetly. The past will wait. And in the dark, love still lingers. The lantern flickers one final time, casting golden rings across your thoughts. The stories have quieted, the laughter has faded, and your pulse has slowed to a gentle hum beneath the blankets. You've wandered through stone corridors and candlelit chambers, through secrets woven into veils and letters tucked under straw. You've met the shy, the bold, the awkwardly sweet, and the fiercely devoted. They were strangers once, but not anymore. As your body sinks into the mattress and your breath becomes the rhythm of silence, let the weight of those centuries soften. Let the voices blur into dreams. No need to hold on tightly, this history, like love itself, lingers without needing to be grasped. You are part of it now. Every time you wonder if someone long ago felt what you feel, the answer is yes. Every time you think your longing is too strange or your desire too sharp, know that someone in a woolen shift or iron helmet once felt the same. In the quiet between prayers. In the flicker between chores. In the hush of the almost touch. You carry them with you, and they carried you, in their own way. So breathe in once more. Let it all melt away. The ache. The giggles. The curiosity. The candlelit longing. You've earned your rest, dear dreamer. Let the night wrap you in wool and whisper. The Middle Ages are quiet now. The heart is still beating. And you are home.